This is really very close to my interest, and I'm looking forward to intense cooperation in the future. And this is a midterm perspective, but in short term I'm looking forward to a great discussion. And since, if I understand correctly, all of you have read the paper, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
And what I want to do by means of introduction, because I don't want to lose much time talking here, and I'd rather hear from you and have a good discussion here. But let me say a couple of words on the basic ideas. First, on the context. Why is this topic relevant? Why should we be thinking about collective responsibility of random collections? Why isn't it enough to discuss the responsibility of corporations, right? That's a big topic and a well-established topic. And everybody agrees that it is an important topic. How exactly are corporations, integrated group agents, how exactly are they responsible? Who exactly is responsible if a corporation is responsible? That's a big discussion, but the responsibility of random collections is a little less discussed in the current literature, but I think it is more important because I want to claim that we can understand the kind of responsibility corporations have only once we've understood what it means to share responsibility, even in such cases in which we are randomly collected. And here is a way, I'm not sure I have it in the paper, but here is a way of putting the relevance of the topic in a very general way, because what's here on the screen is basically the situation classical political philosophy has described as the state of nature. So the assumption is there's a bunch of individuals and there's something they ought to do, they ought to be doing together. And the bunch of individuals is not yet a society, is not yet a social integrate. It's just a bunch of people. It's a random collection. And yet, there's something they ought to be doing together. So if that's correct, if this is the question of the responsibility of random collections, I would say, in a sense, what we're talking about here is the most basic issue in political philosophy. So how to understand the responsibility of random collections, the responsibility that's not just one individual's and not just one corporation's, but that's somehow, shared among many. And of course, there is this paradigm case which is really the paradigm in the literature, and it's from a paper by Virginia Held from 1970. It's the subway example. You all read it in the paper. And then there is this basic decision: shall we go distributive or shall we go collectivist, collective about the example? And both ways to go, it's a sort of a dilemma, because there's something to say in favor and against each of the ways. So in the individual case, it's that basically when a random collection is responsible, that's a sort of responsibility had by each of the participants. So, by the way, I think that the distinction between distributions and collections is one of the metaphysically most basic distinctions, and I'm encouraging metaphysical work on that distinction. There isn't a lot of literature on the distinction between a distribution and a collection. The intuitive idea is, in our case, a distributive reading of the responsibility of random collections would be that each of the individuals has a responsibility. A collective reading would be that there's something in virtue of which the collection has a responsibility. Now, there's something to be said against each of these readings, and in the individual reading, the problem, of course, is that in health case, no one individual has a responsibility to intervene. And the collective reading, the disadvantage here, the obvious disadvantage here is that a random collection isn't anything of the sort that can be responsible because it doesn't even exist as an agent, right? How can something that's not an agent be responsible? So my understanding of responsibility is that responsibility is conceptually tied to blame. Wherever there is responsibility, there's got to be somebody who can be blamed in the case where that agent doesn't live up to his or her responsibility. So I don't think it makes sense to speak of responsibility where there is no blame in the case the responsibility is not being met. So blame is something we do, blaming people, it's an activity, right? It's a reactive attitude, and it always targets agents. However, a random collection is not an agent, right? It's just a bunch of people. Maybe you can blame a corporation. You call up their office and you blame the corporation. But a random collection doesn't have a phone number. It doesn't have a representative. There's nobody you can blame. That's a problem with the collective reading, but as you realized, I'm defending the collective reading, a sort of the collective reading. And I do so not by following Sarah Chan's solution. Sarah Chan basically says, well, we've got to bite the bullet. There are random collections that are collectively responsible and yet not an agent. And then we have this problem of understanding responsibility without blame. And I think that's wrong, and that's why I introduce the idea which is closest to my heart. I've been defending it for 15 years now. The idea that in order to understand sharedness among people, we've got to account for people in terms of plural subjects, and the way in which people are a plural subject is in terms of their being plurally, pre-reflectively self-aware of themselves as a subject. So that's the account, and I'm looking forward to presenting you the account in more detail tomorrow. But that's the idea I bring in here to account for, that's basically way too much to present here, to account for the possibility that actually a random collection under some circumstances, a random collection, not under any circumstance, but under some circumstances, a random collection can be collectively responsible. And the condition is whether or not they were or they could have been plurally, pre-reflectively self-aware of their responsibility as theirs, plurally. So whenever this is the case, it's the collection that's responsible, but of course the participating individuals, it's not an emerging extra agent that's the target of blame here. But it's not a distribution of individuals either, rather it's the individuals as one, not an extra agent, not three individuals and then the collection, but the three, not the three individually, but the three together. So that's the basic idea. I don't know, is this enough in terms of introduction, or shall I open the box a little bit and go into the details?
Well, I think it's okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, because everyone read the paper, so...
All right, so shall I sit down and
Yeah, of course.
So that I can take notes during the discussion.
So I am an assistant professor at Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade, and my background is quite different than yours, I believe. So mainly I'm interested in philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognition. So I do deal with collective subjectivity, but from a different perspective, I would say. From the perspective of cognitive science and the distributed cognition and so on. And I did have some knowledge about philosophy of law, thanks to Petar Boemic, actually, because I was his assistant for a brief time when he was teaching philosophy of law. So I have some background on responsibility and some background on subjectivity, but not together, and in this context of morality and ethics. So is that enough for my introduction? Okay, so given my different background, I'm not sure if I'm going to pose a valid question, but I was just trying to understand what is at issue here. So as I understand it, so in these kind of cases where there is no group, so beforehand, so there is just a random bunch of people, so, and there is some kind of incentive to act, to help someone or something like that. So I would say that in these cases, first we have, so we can identify two kinds of responsibilities. One is to constitute a group. So first, we should constitute an agent who can then act. And then this agent has a responsibility to act in appropriate manner, right? So, and these two kinds of responsibilities are different. The first one would be the kind of distributive, individual kind of responsibility, and the second one is collective. And in this kind of relation, it's kind of, so it's different than simply individual and simply collective, right? So it's two-part responsibility, but I think the main question is the relation between these two kinds of responsibilities. So it reminds me of a case, so I don't know, something bad happens in your home to your spouse or a parent or something. And so you cannot help them by yourself, right? But you have to call a doctor. So, but you have the responsibility to call a doctor because there is a doctor who has the responsibility to help your spouse or a parent or so on. So my responsibility is partly also this responsibility is rooted in the other responsibility to help someone. And I cannot be attributed to this kind of responsibility because I'm not a doctor and I cannot help it. So there is something very similar in these two cases. So there is a means and kind of relation. So my calling a doctor or our constituting a group is means to an end to form an agent or to call an agent which can act. So this is producing or inviting an agent which will act. Okay, so this is the first part, which I think I get, or maybe not. And the connection is very tricky, I think. And so first of all, we have to have knowledge about means and ends and so on. And then it seems like a case of downward causation or something like that. So there is something distant which is not happening, which is influencing something beforehand. And so I'm going to explain it more, and then my question comes. So when everything goes right, it seems okay. Like we constituted a group, we acted, and yay. And we could be praised that we did a good thing and we were responsible for saving a person's life or something like that. But when the first thing fails, it seems that everything fails somehow. And so we fail to constitute a group. So this is the scenario that you're actually describing. And so the first part failed. And what happened is that agent was not formed. So this responsibility that partly constituted the first responsibility cannot exist now because there is no agent. And if there is no agent, there is no responsibility to be added. So it's kind of, so it seems that our responsibility rests on a responsibility of fictitious or hypothetical entity which doesn't exist now. And it seems that we are now resolved, which doesn't seem right. But this means that we were not to be attributed with responsibility in the first scenario where everything was going okay. So I think that this kind of scenarios actually help us see that there is something wrong about this kind of connected responsibilities or dependent responsibility, where one responsibility can actually create a different one, which should then, so there is kind of a loop, so that they are interdependent, and so like the loop cannot start in the first place, because first we have to have an agent to, so this is my question, because we are dealing with a hypothetical agent and hypothetical responsibility, which should make us act in the first place to form a group. So I don't know if my question was clear. Probably not, because I'm not clear with it myself, but it seems that all these cases, so in calling a doctor or actually helping a person, there is no responsibility of the individual who called the doctor, to whom, which we can afterward attribute some other shared responsibility in saving a life. So the only responsibility of this person was to call a doctor, or the only responsibility of an agent in this situation is just to form a group and nothing else. And if the group is formed, then we can talk about. But then how can we have a responsibility to form a group? Because that's dependent on the future responsibility of an agent which doesn't exist. So I'm not sure. So what is, my question then is, what is the connection of these different responsibilities? Are they dependent? Is the second one constitutive of the first one or not? And how they are constituted in the first place?
So the second is the responsibility of the group to act, right?
Yeah.
And the first is the responsibility of the individuals to form a group.
To form a group, to initiate the joint attention or whatever is needed to form a group, because it's only a group which can act in these cases, right? So.
Yeah. I want to say that actually, under normal circumstances, the individuals in the subway train are a group. So they are already an agent. But that agent is a random collection. That isn't an agent that is organized or has a decision structure or is anything even close to a group agent in Pettit's and List's sense. But still, these people, in virtue of their being pretty effectively self-aware of the situation, they share responsibility as a plural subject. So, I mean, if you want to argue for the model that, I mean, your whole question seems to rest on the assumption that in the first instance there is the underlying or somehow metaphysically primary distributive responsibility of the individuals to get their act together, to form a group. And then only on a second level there is something like collective responsibility, because this presupposes a group, and there was no group, right? Ultimately I want to deny that. I want to say, well, you know, even in that situation they are already in this together in the way an agent is. Because agency is basically, you know, the ability to know what it is you're doing, and that's a special sort of, you know, knowledge that's pre-reflective, groundless belief that has been analyzed in the literature in the singular case, and that also holds in the plural case. So that's the line, and I think the most intuitive way of making clear that there's something fishy with the layered account is that whenever something like this happens, you know, an intervention not ensuing a public situation where people could have come to the aid by acting together, if you distribute that responsibility, all you can do is blaming people for not having formed a group. And you don't blame anybody for not acting. But the moral thing is the not acting. That's the thing. You know, you want to account for that. And I try to elucidate a little bit the difference even in the individual case. You know, it makes a difference whether you blame somebody for not having made it the case that he or she acts, or whether you blame somebody for not acting. And I want to have it straightforward. But then you have to account for the feature in virtue of which a random collection can be blameworthy. And I want to argue that, you know, that's it, I got it. It's plural, plurireflective self-awareness.
Okay, so then you can add this, if we layer it, so we have this problem and my account actually solved this problem.
Yes,
okay,
we have this responsibility gap.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So that answers my question. Can I add anything?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'm passing the word. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Because I'd like to connect with this yes. Very much. This idea is fascinating. This idea that random collections are in fact agents, even though they don't have a problem in the first. I sympathize and agree with you on that. My query is really about your thoughts about the exact relationship between responsibility and blame. You mentioned that you think that it makes no sense to talk about collective responsibility for a particular action without being able to assign blame for failing to act, right? As in Virginia Hell's case. Now, I'm not so sure about the exact proximity of responsibility and blame. I would like just to tease you a little bit on that. Look at the legal concept of subjective responsibility in criminal law. And I think this is a useful concept because it elucidates some of these controversies concerning the relationship between responsibility and guilt. There's this idea in criminal law that when I commit a crime, I can be subjectively responsible for that crime if I could have theoretically chosen not to have committed the crime, right? So I'm theoretically able to decide whether to punch someone on the street or not, right? So if I decide to punch someone, I'm subjectively responsible for the offense. Now, this is not the same as criminal blame, because criminal blame is what is called in criminal law the mens rea responsibility, the guilty mind. In order to be guilty, in addition to being subjectively responsible, I must have satisfied the two conditions in acting. I must have known that what I was about to do was wrong, which is the cognitive criteria. It's the McNaughton criteria, the famous McNaughton criteria. And I must have been able, the volitional criteria, I must have been able to have acted otherwise, right? So if I was under some kind of compulsion, whether it was internal psychological compulsion or social compulsion in the case of collectives as agents, then my blame is reduced, then the ability of the society to attribute blame to me is reduced, even though my subjective responsibility is undiminished. Now look at the way people behave when they witness someone being victimized in the street. It's been written about a lot. People generally tend to mimic the behavior of each other. So you see a case of violence in the street, and people observe the reactions of the other people who do nothing, but at the same time they tend to minimize any signs that they give away that they are observing the others. So they appear to each other as though they are independently making a decision not to interfere, and that makes it easier for everyone to say, okay, this must be something that doesn't concern me, so I won't interfere. Now, does that reduce blame at all? Do social mechanisms which operate within collective within random collections as agents, are they capable of reducing the blame, like in the criminal law, by creating a sense of compulsion, a sort of compulsion which reduces my individual blame as a participant in a random collection, while at the same time not reducing the subjective responsibility as such of such agents for not have interfering, because theoretically they could have and should have interfered, and as you said in your introduction, all of those three principles are satisfied. I know what is going on, I know that I should act, but I don't act. But there's a compulsion within the group. So do you think that this is able to generate some kind of distance between responsibility and blame in this context?
Yeah, interesting. I haven't thought it through, but it's very interesting and we should discuss it in more detail. My initial hunch was that what I'm using here is obviously the fuller concept of responsibility, where there is not only, you called it subjective responsibility. I thought maybe it's like, you know, causal in terms of counterfactual sensitivity. So it wouldn't have happened had I not, or had I interfered, had I not omitted an act which was open to me. But that's obviously, in my view, and I agree with you, we maybe not only legal philosophy, but even ordinary language uses responsibility in that sense where it is not sufficient for blame. Right? All of us could, right now, we could save a bunch of people by we just happen not to know what it is, right? And it's in virtue of that lack of knowledge, the other component, that we're not, you know, morally responsible, right? So I'd say that what you labeled the mens rea domain, where this special knowledge, and I am making a fuss of the sort of knowledge, right? I want to argue against Virginia held that not any knowledge is the right one. You know, the Ernst Mach case, to which I construct in this paper a plural parallel. I argue not any kind of knowledge suffices, but it's got to be self-knowledge. It's got to include self-knowledge of the moral nature, you know. I think only where this is included, the responsibility we're talking about is of the morally irrelevant kind, right? And I guess that this responsibility involves what you call subjective responsibility. So subjective responsibility and the mens rea thing together constitute. But I guess maybe I should be a bit clearer concerning how exactly I use responsibility here. That's helpful. The bunch of people under social conformity pressure, that's interesting, and I haven't got a clear intuition. Well, when you presented the case, so your case was there's somebody being beaten up by the bully, but and there are individuals around, but now in addition, these individuals are somewhat, they have this imitation thing going on, and so you, as a participant, you look at the crime being committed, but then the second look is to the next person, and you somehow mimic what you perceive that person is doing, right?
Look at an example of domestic violence. For decades, we had a situation in the whole Europe where domestic violence was perceived by most as something that we shouldn't interfere with, as something that was seen as belonging, a conflict which belonged to other people who had a relationship which we were not a part of, and therefore had a limited legitimacy in interfering. Then you had a hype up in the media and in the public, and now you have legislation and all kinds of messages in the public sphere which say interfere by all means. And now everybody is reporting everyone for real and imaginary cases of domestic violence. This is now the topic of the day. So anybody can now report anyone with 2 witnesses or without witnesses, and it will create a general social pressure for the prosecution, the police, and everyone to do something. So depending on what sort of messages we get from society, we will perceive our entitlements to interfere in a particular conflict differently.
Yes.
Now, where is our blame there?
Yeah, interesting. I'm a bit conservative in this domain. I mean, looking back into history, where people just had different conception of the moral obligations placed on them, and in hindsight, our judgment is that they were behaving horribly because they thought it was okay. I must admit that I'm somewhat reluctant to blame them. Of course, I mean, it cannot be the case that unless you accept that you should be acting, you're not responsible. But the further criterion is that you should have known. You should have known better. So even if you didn't know, you can still be blameworthy if it can be said that you should have known. Now, should people in the 17th century or 16th century, Swiss people were the last to burn a witch, the last in Europe. In the 18th century, I believe it was 1780, Kant was writing his Critique of Pure Reason, and people in Switzerland burned the last witch because they believed this is the devil operating on their community, and they've got to save, they really thought that here is something that's so dangerous that really their lives and the lives of their children is in danger by the presence of this evil. They really believed it. They wouldn't have burned a person just like that. They thought that there is evil that justified doing it, and they did it. And they were totally wrong. Now, do you want to blame them? I think there are circumstances. One circumstance is, my God, there was literature around. You could read up about witch hunts and stuff. Enlightenment was going on. Why? At least, that the local vicar of the Protestant church, it was in a Protestant area, he should have read the literature. They should have been more enlightened at the time, But, if you go further back, I'm somewhat reluctant of, judging all of them in terms of strict outcome liability. So there's got to be this, limit, epistemic limit to responsibility. And if it's just, conformity, I would say nowadays, if people are just imitating others, so the excuse would be, well, I didn't gather people together because I'm always doing what other people do. I don't think this is acceptable, right? Why would we accept that? I mean, who would say, well, okay, yeah, so I see no extenuating circumstance in the adoption of the maxim, always do what others do. I'm not sure I'm addressing your question.
You are. You're just making me think further. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I want to ask another one. We had a case here. I'd like to be very practical because I think your topic is capable of addressing very practical issues. We had a case here a year or two ago where a random collection of people, including one man and 3 or 4 women of dubious morality, driving in a Mini Morris Countryman, after a night out, hit a young man who was pushing his car, which had broken down in the yellow lane on a bridge in downtown Belgrade. The victim died, and the perpetrator, the driver, the young man, hid the car with which the crime had been committed and escaped to China and was later extradited here. And all of the media were full of the title pages said, they were using the phrase the killer countryman, the killer, the murderer. This was a traffic accident, you see. But that prosecutors were under pressure. I spoke to some of the prosecutors at the time. They were under pressure to implement those new directions which they had received, that they should pursue this guy in the strictest possible way allowed by the law. And some of them were complaining. They were saying, look, we don't dare say in public that there is a legal concept which is called the contribution by the victim. This means that being a victim doesn't mean that you are not guilty for what happened to you. If I meet Mike Tyson in the street and he walks past me and knocks me down, he commits a crime. But this crime is a lesser crime if before he knocks me, I say to him, look, you nigger, you idiot, you know, and you know, I provoke him. There's a contribution of the victim. This guy was pushing his car without the yellow row, you know, without it being properly marked in the dark, you know, but nobody dared, no prosecutor dared to argue in public that, you know, there was a contribution by the victim and that the blame of this random collection, and all of them were quite dislikable because of the, they were wealthy, they were reckless, they were generally reckless in their lives, but they were not necessarily reckless that night. So you see, you say it's not an extenuating circumstance. Imagine that you're a prosecutor. We now have laws which are being brought in, and you have them in Austria as well. Laws which are the so-called lex specialis laws, which basically militate against the systemic criminal legislation, which say, okay, if you assault a member of a national a minority, you know, then you will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Whereas in the normal systemic legislation, the prosecutor has the principle of opportunité, right? The principle to decide whether and to what extent to prosecute something. So basically your autonomy is very much diminished as a prosecutor. So you do have extenuating circumstances, even though legally you can still say, okay, I will not go along with the current practice. But this practice has normative features. It is a normative practice, right? And we live with the rule of the media and everything, and public pressure. We live under increasing normative pressure by all kinds of sources of norms which are not necessarily officialized.
Yeah, in traffic, I mean, I'm not an expert in legal philosophy, but I hear that in many countries, Switzerland included, and I know the Swiss system a little better than the Austrian system, even though I'm in Austria now, but I've moved there only 5 or 6 years ago. There's a general tendency in traffic, especially in speeding, there is this tendency to, and I don't know the terminology in English, if you're speeding, you're not just assumed to be reckless, but if you cause an accident, you're gonna be
criminally negligent.
You're gonna be charged with at least in German the word is Eventualvorsatz. What's the term in English? You know, when the attitude is not I don't care what happens, but the attitude is, well, if it happens, so be it. What's that? All right, yeah. And I think this is a general tendency, and it is, I guess, I mean, from a, I don't know, sociological point of view, I'm quite certain that later times will look back on our times less as a time of witch hunts, but as a time that accepted an awful blood loss on the streets, right? I mean, many people are dying on the streets, and this is obviously a problem, right? And this is not going to be accepted in, I don't know, 100 years. Historians will look back and observe with astonishment how cool we were with all these deaths on the street. But yeah, I don't know, this is not directly related to the paper, but there are pressures in the legal system, and some of which I'm a bit sympathetic towards, like in the traffic case, even though I do think that, you know, when there are attenuating circumstances, they have to be taken into account. In other cases, I'm very skeptical. I think that we tend to be way too harsh on some crimes under public pressure. And that's also a topic you raised, you know, public expectations and the huge influence this has, not only on legislation, but also on, you know, court proceedings. And that's horrifying, but I'm mostly concerned with, you know, moral blame here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, just one Professor Kraljice. Very much.
I'm Dr. Popkins. I teach philosophy for specialty of political science here at the university. I'm not going to speak further about my background because we are in the middle of the talk, and in talk it's important only what we say or what we won't say.
Fortunately,
I'm not so fluent in English as Alexander and Milena.
If you want, you can speak
But
in German.
no. But still, I'm going to try to spell out something. Actually, I don't see, at least at the first glance, anything problematic in your paper. But still, I'm going to restrain myself on few remarks, and perhaps then we are going to find out that there are still some disagreements between you and me. First of all, you notice that in case that a person which is a part of random collection, if he tries to make the other peoples which are a member of that so-called group to do something when being witness of a case of abusement, and still in case that if that particular person fails to make others to react, he or she is still responsible. Unfortunately, I agree with you, but then I'm bothered with the fact that in spite effort of that person to make others to do something, he is objectively responsible, although I would say he is not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And so, from the point of view of your line of argumentation, you are right. But from point of view of sense of justice or what is just, it is somehow not okay with me.
Mm-hmm.
The other point, it came out during your answer to Milena's intervention. The question is from what particular moment of time a group of people who is in a car or subway and who witness a case of abusement, from what particular moment they start to be a group, or at least to be eligible to be considered as a group. I would say that when they enter a car, they are just a random bunch of people and nothing more. But only in case when something happens, and not something, but the thing, the occurrence that make them obliged to react, and only from that moment on, if they fail to react, they are responsible. But still, from that moment, they are actually eligible to be considered as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third point, you are speaking somewhere close to the end of your paper of effort of, so to say, aware person to create a joint attention,
mm-hmm.
which means of other people which are member of that so-called random collection, to pay their attention on that particular occurrence which is actually going on. But still, when we are speaking, as you do, about a case of brutal violence, it is impossible that somebody sitting or standing in that subway car did not notice that. So whatever he did or thought at the time when violence started, it is impossible to imagine that he didn't notice that. So I think it is not necessary to make some efforts to pay attention of the others, what's going on, because they are all perfectly aware of that, even though who look away. And so now that means that we have in that situation a case of
collective self-awareness, including those persons who fail or who pretend who look through the window and who pretend they didn't notice anything. And one just more remarks concerning my first point. That is something which is quite unusual for me, or unusual from point of view of common sense. That means to be responsible without being guilty. Are you talking? I don't think you implied that, but still, for the sake of discussion, are we talking about duty to be hero, which means when you try to persuade the other persons to create a reaction group, and if they fail to do so, the only way, according to your line of argumentation, to avoid the responsibility is to attack the bunch of abusers and to risk to being beaten by them. So, is it possible? Is it any other option to avoid the responsibility unless with the exclusion that one, also to attack the attackers and to be beaten as the victim is?
Yeah, very interesting point. I'm not sure I got all of them, and please jump in whenever I'm misunderstanding you. So, three main points. What about, I mean, the point concerning responsibility without guilt? I think I totally agree with you. So that's what I wanted to say, that if we didn't get our act together and we let it happen, but you're not to blame because you really tried to get us together, right? There is a sense in which you're still in it, because you're gonna say, we failed, even though you personally did what you could. But it's still true of you that you're part of the collective that didn't do what it should have done. You're still part of it, even though you did individually what you could. Now, I want to keep it as concrete as possible. I think for the court proceedings, what matters is that you should be included in the trial. You should be sitting there, because, you know, I'm one of the group. We failed. You were in the group too. You should be sitting there, but you should get full recognition that you did everything you could, and I should acknowledge my guilt to you for undermining your effort of getting our act together. Because I, as a passive member, I wronged you. So in that sense, I think it is, in a very concrete way, it is important for the actor who failed, us, to be together in the position of the blamed party. And you included in it, but you getting the recognition for what you did, which was right, and you were wronged by all the others. So that's how I see the normative infrastructure of that case. But in order to account for this full infrastructure, you've got to acknowledge that, you know, that this is us. We are to blame. Duty to be a hero. I'm not sure I exactly understood what you meant. And maybe this connects to the third point, where you said that there's something fishy about the scenario. You said that, you know, when this abuse is going on in a subway car, it is inconceivable for people not to notice, right? Everybody's going to notice when this abuse is going on. And I must confess, when you said it, I realized that when I wrote the paper, I had in mind a car which is not a subway car, but a car with different compartments, you know, like a train car. In a train car, it is well conceivable. Now, in subway cars, I don't know about all the subways in the world, but most subway cars in most cities, Belgrade doesn't have a subway, but in all other big cities, these are cars where the seats are at the, you know, both sides of the cars have rows of seats. And sometimes I think in New York there are some compartments. If the seats are just by the side, it's inconceivable. If there is abuse going on, everybody sees it. But if there are compartments... Okay, yeah. Exactly. We have to amend the example, but I just realized that I had a scenario in mind which made it easier to think of the case where there are just 5 people and not everybody's noticing it. But we have to construct... I'm going to think about this suggestion, but I guess you'll agree that it is conceivable that situations be of the sort under which it is not automatic that everybody's got to notice abuse that's going on. Also, I could construct a case where the abuse is not so loud or not so obvious, something along these lines. This relates to the question of the duty to be a hero, because depending on the way you imagine the situation, any attempt even to gather a group together might direct the perpetrator's attention on you, right? Even if you say, hey, we've got to do something, it might be the case that you're getting in the focus. And my intuition would be, well, you know, some risk you've got to take. But duty to be a hero, to me, it seems to be a contradiction in terms, because the hero, the concept, my concept of a hero... Yeah, you asked whether there is a duty to be a hero. I don't want to argue that you're defending the thesis, but you asked the question, is there a duty to be a hero? And I would say there cannot be a duty to be a hero, because the hero is the agent who does supererogatory deeds, meaning deeds that cannot be morally demanded. But I would say that in a realistic scenario of that type, you're always gonna run some risk, even when just trying to gather together people, because you might, you know, attract the perpetrator's attention, and you ought to incur some risk. But in my view, ought implies can, and if it's clear that you cannot subdue the bully alone, then you ought not try to subdue the bully. Now there is a sense, trying is always a difficult word. There's a sense of trying in which any doing implies trying. There is a different sense of trying in which trying is a proper action term. There's a sense of trying in which you can try to do even what you know cannot be done. In that case, the condition of satisfaction of your intention is to do the trying and not the doing. And I think in that sense of trying, you certainly ought not try, meaning that you ought not, you know, make the appropriate moves that would lead to the subduing of the bully were he not so strong. So I'm not sure if this answers your question, but maybe I can address the very difficult second question. You want to know when exactly?
This is part of my misunderstanding as well, because it seems like there has to be some kind of a conscious act where you admit that you're part of a group, or that you really switch your attention to the group or something like that, so that there is even some kind of a decision that you make. So attention is something that's in our power.
I think Bernhard is against that,
yeah, he is, but then you have a problem when how does it happen? So do you constantly think I'm part of this group? No, not thinking, you don't have to think, but you're part of many groups then,
yes.
Whatever. partly that's the same question. When you become a group, if there is not a
I mean, like
not
entering the car,
really.
you mentioned that, entering the car. If random collections, or not random, but a few friends enter the same car, that's a group because they have the same intentionality, yeah? The collective intentionality to do it. Yeah, of course, yeah. Why?
Okay.
You know, I mean, if I'm entering the car with you, what? I'm not going, you know, we have the same purposes, yeah? Well,
Which one? To reach the same part of town or city?
yeah. Or whatever, yeah.
But it's not
Very important
connected
intention.
to the-
But you know, people may enter the car and you don't even notice, so there might be somebody sitting there.
With those people, you really,
For instance.
yeah, you're really against this situation, and I don't know, whatever.
There's a principle in Japanese etiquette which says when you enter a room full of people, the first thing you should do is blend in. And I think this is fairly universal. We Westerners are used to thinking about ourselves as being lone rangers. When you're walking into a room full of people and immediately asserting yourself and saying something smart, looking better than the others. I'm not sure that this is superficial. I think most of us deep down that was Japanese style. So we are sort of subconsciously aware of the relevant group.
Yeah.
I sit here now and I would like to talk to you continually, which I'm regularly doing, monopolizing the discussion, right? But I'm still subconsciously aware that this is not what I should be doing in this group, so I will now hold myself back. At the same time as being here, I'm also part of a group of members of my age group and all other kinds of groups. But I'm still implicitly aware of the group and unsuccessfully trying to blend in and trying to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that, I mean this difference between what you depicted as the Japanese model of riding public transportation to the Western model, I'd say it's a difference mostly in self-understanding. It's an ideological difference that doesn't really refer to the practice because, you know, in the practice we're much more Japanese than we would acknowledge. I totally agree with that. We have this self-image as, you know, the rugged individual, but we wouldn't be able to live together were we to put this into actual practice. But I mean, my strategy concerning this type of question, so when does it come into being, is usually a negative one. And I have two, so it's an ex negativo reply or a turning of the table reply. First, I'd like to argue against the view that, well, you know, it's clear as soon as we've made a decision, right? Then we're a group, right? But you know, problem is that decision cannot be just my individual decision and your individual decision. It's got to be decided together, and deciding is something we're doing together, meaning that in order for us to make any decision, we've got to be an agent already. And we know that from the literature about subjectivity, German idealism, you know, it's the way we're self-constituted is not by making a decision, because it's got to be the subject of decision already. And Gilbert has this horrible problem with, and I spoke to her a million of times, and she just doesn't get it, that basically if you want to argue that any plural subject comes into being by means of a joint commitment, and if that joint commitment is basically something we're doing together, we're entering together, you know, every plural subject presupposes a plural subject, we're back into the infinite regress. And, you know, this whole literature about the pre-reflective level in the individual case answer to that type of problem, and we urgently need to take it to the plural, you know. If we're going to be serious about plural subjects, we've got to learn from that problem. So that's ex negativo. I'm still not answering when and how, but I'm saying that, you know, you have a concept of a plural subject, but yours is insufficient. And then concerning the, what was the other thing? Yeah, then the other move is, a question to all of you who are parents. When did your kid become a moral subject? When? Please tell me. When did it happen? So if you can't answer this question, why do you create a problem for me with my plural subject account, with identifying when? You know, I know it's a weak reply, but I do want to argue for a sort of analogy between singular subjectivity and plural subjectivity. Now with the kid, it certainly becomes an agent, partly because of you addressing it as an agent, right? And that would speak in favor of the view that there's something about there's something happening and somebody being blameworthy that makes it a plural agent. But it cannot be, you know, reactive attitudes cannot be constitutive of agency, right? It's not that you really make an animal a subject by reproaching it, because you can try it with your cat. It won't work, right? It's perhaps something like a subject, but it's not a subject in the moral domain. So I know this is all very defensive and totally dissatisfying. But there is psychological literature which I find interesting, you know, where people trying to, for example, certainly a basic step is, you know, this capacity of joint attention, this sharing of gaze following and pointing out, the ictic pointing behavior, where I'd say, yeah, that's a plural subject right there, right? Because these guys are engaging in these practices of joint attention, but it's maybe not the most basic thing, so I don't know.
Excuse me, why it is so hard to imagine that a reaction of some random collection of people could be the point from which on they start to recognize themselves as a group?
I would say it is certainly easily imaginable that they come to recognize themselves as a group reflectively. So this is where it all becomes political, because now everybody is thinking about what it is we are doing. But this is something different from just being in it together without even noticing.
Can I add something? I don't know if this example adds anything, but we can imagine a similar situation. It could be a movie situation when there is a bomber in subway or something like that, and there is a group of people, right? But their time passes and somehow they organize and all organized, but they split in two groups, right? And one wants to act and the other doesn't, and even the other wants to prevent the first one to act and so on. But whatever happens, then according to this story, there is just one group, or there are two groups. According to your story, so should they all be blamed if nothing happens? Without any respect to the fact that they had completely different intentions and made different decisions collectively, but differently. So because they're according to this story, that they were just all part of one group. So whatever happens, they all share the responsibility. But to me, it seems like there are two groups, not one group.
Yeah. I'd say it's the scenario there is a subway car, the bully and all, and now
it's more dangerous or something, so that there is
okay, it's a bomb,
like
and a subset of individuals, they are getting their act together and they act together, but they don't succeed because the others are so passive. Is that?
No. One group wants to disarm the bomber, and the other group doesn't want to do anything because it's too dangerous and everything can blow up. So they have very clear intentions, but completely the opposite.
So everybody agreed that they have to do something about it, but they couldn't agree on a...
One group agrees that they shouldn't do anything, and the other group wants to do something. So, and in the end, they don't do anything, and then they are blamed.
And why? And now explain to me why. I mean, if some people decided to do something about it, why did they not actually do something about it?
Let's say that some from the other group actually intervened and they couldn't.
Yeah, I'd say it's similar to it's similar to the case where just one individual is active. So
it is, but
now it's a collective, right? I'd say that the case is more complex now. It's actually three agents, right?
Yeah.
It's the group that wanted to be active. It's the total group. That's basically the total group is responsible for not doing.
There is a multiplication of agents.
Yeah, it's a multiplication of agents, and that happens, and that's a deep thing. That happens once you go serious about plural agents along my lines. It's going to be an awful lot of agents, an awful lot of subjects. Some very short-lived, right? Just a subway ride, or maybe just an exchange of glance. It's a plural subject right there, and then it's gone. So
you're fine.
I'm totally fine. I like subjects. Let there be as many as there can. I'm fine with it, but also I want to say that on the other hand, the most lasting subjects, some of them live, and I do think they live, even though they don't have, they're not tied to a biological body in the same way. Still, I want to argue they live. There's a concept of life that applies to them. Some of them live for centuries. So not all of them are so short-lived. Some of them live.
The concept of life or concept of time?
Well, there's time without life, but there's no life without time. So I don't know. I mean, well, life is in time, right? But I'm afraid that soon we'll have to discuss Heidegger's concept of death. I'm not sure I am still addressing the question. I would say in your scenario, there is a group that undermined the other group's effort and thereby wronged that group's effort. So there are not just the individuals and one collective that are relevant, but the individuals and three collectives: the active group, the obstructive group, and the total group, who is ultimately the target of blame, even though within that blame only makes visible the sense in which the obstructive group wronged the active group. It's a bit many groups, yeah. I mean, all I can do is to be open about it. There's going to be a proliferation of subjects, but you tell me why this should be a problem. Just saying, well, it's so many subjects, for me is not sufficient to let the account go.
Okay.
Question. It's on plural.
Please. Yes.
So, my name is Olga Mikulic. I am a PhD student at the University of Belgrade, and I'm also working on some projects here at the Institute. My field of interest is phenomenology, especially Husserl's phenomenology, social and political philosophy, and recently cognitive science.
You were in Lumen, yeah? You defended your master's?
Yeah, yes, I defended my master's.
Oh, okay.
My question is mainly about plural reflective self-awareness, because you argue in your text that this is actually a condition that needs to be fulfilled in order to attribute responsibility to random collections. So while I was reading this text, as well as your other text on plural pre-reflective self-awareness, a number of questions occurred to me, they are about how this plural self-awareness works, actually. So I understood that it's you take it to be a basic form of sociality. But so my question is, are we always, is it constantly at work? Do we always find ourselves somehow plurally, pre-reflectively self-aware? Is it at work even when we are alone, or only when other people are around? Is it selective? So is it, does it work in a way to, can I base my judgments and decisions on which groups to enter or enter into interaction or join somehow? So where do I want to join actions and where I don't, and with whom? Also, what is the content of it? Content of plural. So is it like some sort of sedimented, implicit, habitual knowledge of everything we've learned about how people behave, how people interact, what people should or should not do? This sort of like implicit know-how that we have when we interact with other people or join groups, and also how people perceive us, what kind of social groups we are eligible to, what kind of social roles we are eligible to, and so on. Also, does it have to exist? So I understood that for you it has to exist in plurality of, like every individual partakes in plural reflective self-awareness. That's the way I understood at least. But the question is, do we all have to, or do all individuals have to have the same content? Do we have to think of our group participation and what our group should do or should not do in the same manner? Do we have to be aware somehow of group goals in the same way in order to have this plural reflective self-awareness? And for example, if we take your train or subway example, what if one person does not find herself or himself morally responsible? What if one person does not share this idea, pre-reflectively this idea that we should do something about this? What if one person thinks that, what if one person is scared, just wants to escape, does not want to? There is no pre-reflective moment where this person actually wants to contribute, feels that we should all together do something about it. No, but the person is just scared. So does this exclude this person from plural pre-reflective self-awareness or not? Finally, does plural pre-reflective self-awareness involve shared phenomenal consciousness? Like what is it like for us, experiential sharing of some sort? Okay, so that's...
Very good. I don't know I can address all the issues raised in this very rich comment. Let me focus on a couple of issues. How does it work, plural pre-reflective self-awareness? So I'm, for a long time, I had the basic idea in my habilitation thesis that came out in 2005, where I strictly stuck to the Heidelberg way of thinking about pre-reflective self-awareness. And there the claim is, you can never say what it is. All you can say is what it is not. All you can do in elucidating the essence of subjectivity is pointing out mistakes about it. You know, showing how reflective accounts fail. That's the way how they end up in an infinite regress or a petitio principii. That's how you can account for the underlying, for what subjectivity is. Need not be an essence, but you know what subjectivity is. You can characterize it only negatively. And then I got all these reactions, you know, but what is it? And then I finally decided, you know, let's forget about the Heidelberg School. Let's just try. So what, and I thought that maybe a sort of functionalist approach is a good one. Not functionalist in terms of input-output relations, but functionalist in terms of identifying what something does. And I thought that's not impossible in the individual case, in the singular case. We can say quite a bit about what that special knowledge we have of ourselves, and only of ourselves, of nothing else, what that does. So the basic thing, of course, is probably most of you know that claim that, you know, there is a sort of knowledge that's different, that's of oneself, that's very different from knowledge about anything else. And that self-knowledge, it's not evidential, it's self-identifying, you know. And I identified these functions, you know, what does it do? It establishes identity, it self-commits, the feature in virtue of which beliefs are somebody's commitments, or intentions are somebody's commitments. That's in virtue of my being self-aware of it as being mine, that it commits me. It's only in that way, and it is in that way, that attitudes are commitments. And it authorizes, you know, it puts me in a position of speaking about it that's, you know, different from you saying, well, Bernhard, you don't really believe that, right? So because, well, I do believe, and the way how I know it is different. I know it just like that, you know, without evidence, you know. And then I examined how these are functions, you know, identification, validation, commitment, and authorization. These are functions. That's what self-knowledge does. That's the work of self-knowledge. And I'm examining this maybe tomorrow in the talk, in the plural case, you know, how does it work? So I think I can give a fuller answer to that question tomorrow. Now, the thing about deciding which group, so I guess your worry is how am I in all of this? I mean, sometimes we leave groups, right? And sometimes we form groups. And we are part of many groups. So how does this work? I don't think. Sometimes you don't feel like being part of a group anymore because you're really fed off your partners and you're still somehow in there, right? Sometimes it's not just enough to say, I don't want to be part of it anymore. And certainly it's not enough for two people wanting to be a plural subject that they really are a plural subject. So it seems that, you know, this individual sort of decision to be or not to be part of it is at least not sufficient for you being a part of it. Also, sometimes, as in the subway car, there's not even question of any decision and you're in it. So it seems that it is not even necessary to make any decision or have any preference even that you're in it. So it seems that these attitudes, do I want it or not, are neither necessary nor sufficient for there to be a plural subject. Of course, we, as I take it, all of us are liberal, you know, Democrats, right? And we do not like certain forms of sociality. And we very much like others. The one form we like is the voluntary association. We are highly And please speak up if you disagree with me now. I really like to meet people who disagree on this point. We really like voluntary associations, and this is when people of their own individual will gather together for the pursuit of a purpose. Right? That's wonderful, you know. Every participant wants to be part of it, and that's somehow how it comes to be, right? We like that, and I like it too. And this leads to sort of ideology about what sociality is, that it's somehow based on a, you know, individual decision. But of course it's not. It's a wonderful way of being together, but let's face it, it's not all about sociality. You know, it would be, especially if you want to advocate it from a normative perspective, we should not be ignorant about it not being the normal case, right? It not being ontologically exclusive. It's not that, all of you know how, you know, ontology and normative perspectives, political agendas are intertwined, and sometimes people think it is best to promote an agenda by claiming this is the only way that exists. So I don't want to accuse you of ideology, but I guess since this decision thing is neither necessary nor sufficient for participation in plural subject, I think it's not a fundamental point about the structure of sociality. But
yeah,
it's normatively, it's totally important because we want it.
Can I just clarify my question a bit? So what I was thinking about is, so sometimes we decide using our reflection and we think about it in advance, and then we decide to join a group or not join a group. But when we are pre-reflectively, plurally self-aware, do we, on this pre-reflective level, do we still make a selection or not? Do we just interact with anybody who is around, or can we somehow like make some pre-reflective, let's say, judgments about who to interact with? So that was part of my question, how this pre-reflective self-awareness even works. What is it doing for us? Is it helping us choose?
Can you give maybe an example? I have difficulties with, at the moment, difficulties with the concept of a pre-reflective judgment. Can you give an example of what do you have in mind in concrete terms? Is it
well, for example, I'm walking down the street and I need to ask for directions, and I see two persons, and I immediately turn to one and ask one person for direction, not the other one. Why did I choose the first person?
Yeah, that is a phenomenon that obviously exists. We choose with whom to associate. Yeah, we shouldn't forget that this is really an obvious phenomenon, that we like to be a plural subject with some, and even if you just ask a person for directions, you're doing something together with that person, because there is a plural subject of communication, right? There's communication going on, and that's a joint action. It has a plural subject for it to be joined. You know, we now want to communicate, and the purpose of the communication is you having the information I'm giving you. So that's a plural subject, and obviously, yeah, that's. But you know, I responded just to the issue whether it is you will that somehow makes the plural subject, and obviously it's not, because you know, the engaging in communication is something we're doing together. You may initiate, but it's only in virtue of my taking it up that it becomes communication, and that's something we're doing together. And of course, individual preferences play a big role in the coming about of plural subjects. Yeah. In that way, that we choose whom to approach, we choose whom to associate with, and yeah, that's. also, I mean, sometimes there are these role conflicts, right, where it is at stake whether I should react as a professor or as a private person or as a family member. And it seems that there's something I can do about it, right? But many people say, well, you know, at that point, you should really withdraw to the perspective of your singular soul self and decide. And that's always the last resort of judgment. Is always really just me. And I don't think this is obvious and even normal in such cases, because why shouldn't I judge from the perspective of a professor, whether judging as a professor is the right thing or judging as a family member? Why has it always got to be my sole individual self from which I engage in that role or this role? It can also be from a social perspective. Another point in your very rich comment, does every individual participate in a plural subject? I think this is sort of, I think there's room for a lot of dissidence in plural subjects. And it is often the case that we are doing something even though I'm not engaged in it. And I wouldn't say that, you know, participation, active participation has to be distributive, so that each member is participating for us to be doing. Group goals. I think there is a tendency to overestimate the role of intention in intentionality, which has to do with the proximity of the English word intention to intentionality. And if we go back to the phonological tradition, there was an equal bias towards more passive forms of intentionality. The paradigm of collective intentionality or plural subject phenomena in the phonological literature is the Erlebnis, experience. Well, it's actually something a bit different from just experience. It's lived experience that's more passive, and phonologists usually thought that for Erlebnis, what's it?
Es heißt doživljaj, but we have a word for it.
That's wonderful to me.
Which is negative.
Which is life, as in German.
Ah, yeah, that's wonderful. I like that, because I tend to think that even, especially if you have an Aristotelian concept of life, Erlebnis is a bit better than just intention as a paradigm of sharing, because there is this living together, you know, the Aristotelian idea that the form of our life is a shared form. And I think that very much we're talking about in the current literature discussion is sort of, you know, preconceived of in Aristotle's work on the political nature of humans. But I'm sort of anti-Aristotelian in that I'm open for the possibility of totally. Aristotle would say it is an idiotic life. You know, the idiotes is the person who does not participate in the political. And I'm sympathetic to idiots who just, you know, they don't join. You know, so much of our life is totally private, right? I mean, all of us are idiots, you know, and so much of our lives is not shared. And I wouldn't say that everything has to be shared. I think sharing can be a terrible hassle, and it's very good that we have private lives. So I wouldn't say, you know, some authors say, well, you know, if it's intentionality, it's got to be somehow social. And I don't buy that. And I don't think we need it, because we now can see how intentionality can be shared. once we see that, we need not claim that every intentional attitude is somehow social. For example, along the lines of Habermas, right? He always argues, oh, you cannot, you know, intentionality, that's basically just language, that's public, you know, I'm aware that I addressed only about 1/5 of the issues you raised. Let me just, to conclude, address the person who is afraid in the subway car, right? You had this example. I think that person is totally in it, you know, this, because, you know, so that, what's the situation? That person, is that plurally, pre-reflectively self-aware? You know, we should, no, that person thinks we should not, right? Because it's too dangerous. So that person judges that the moral nature of the act is such that we should not intervene.
In fact, that person is actually only concerned for herself. Or
okay,
himself.
That's an idiot, yeah. Total idiot sitting there.
Just
maybe
wants
it's
to escape.
Maybe it's a person that simply does not have the capacity of sharing intention. Some psychiatrists say that there are conditions that do not allow people to participate. In that sense, I would say that person is off the hook. Some people say that it is a mark of grave forms, especially grave forms of autism, that individuals simply cannot share attitudes. And in that sense, in that case, I would say that person is obviously off the hook. In the case in which a person just is afraid and does not sort of, you know, come to the right judgment that we should intervene, because she just discounts what's happening to the other person as opposed to what could happen to herself. I think that person is not off the hook, because that person should have and could have judged differently.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would like to make comments relying upon contemporary metaphysics of connections on the one hand, and upon the theory of complex systems on the other. This perspective might seem somewhat surprising, but let us remind ourselves that Sarah Rachel Chand's paper, which is so important for the debate on collective responsibility, also suggests that these questions, I am quoting her, promote a particular kind of metaphysics. On the other hand, it is obvious that the questions you analyze are of great importance, not only in the case of highly structured organizations and other incorporated groups, but also for the debates concerning ethics and complex systems as such. What interests me the most is the mechanism through which people become connected to each other. The moment when, according to the Hollywood standoff, Mr. Good, Mr. Bad, and Mr. Ugly hold the gun to each other, or the moment when, according to Virginia Hurd's example, there are individuals in a subway car that witnesses a bully. Let me first introduce certain insights from contemporary metaphysics of connection. One might define connection as something that is stronger than dependence, but is weaker than internal relation. First distinction is pretty clear. If A is connected to B, this connection does not necessarily imply that the existence of A or one of its essential properties depends on the existence of B. The distinction between connection and relation is much more complicated. External relations are external to the nature of the relata, and in that sense they are mere mental projections. For instance, when there is an assertion that A is to the left from B. Internal relations do depend on the nature of the relata, but in fact it would be more precise to claim that internal relation can be reduced to the individual essences of the relata, and therefore it would be redundant to conceive them as sui generis entities. For instance, when there is an assertion according to which A is brighter than B. Connection is different from relation and from dependence as well. There is an extremely rich tradition of the metaphysics of connection, from Leibniz's vinculum substantiale to Gustav Bergman's nexus, from Whitehead's concretions and to Barry Smith's myriad topological connections. What is common to these concepts is that they point to a certain emergence, a certain productivity. For example, the connection and not mere relation between the subject and the predicate results with new meaning, or in the case of a non-formal material connection, if the locomotive is connected to the wagons, a new level of emergence arises. There are a few important characteristics of connection. It is non-reflexive. A can be connected to B, to C, and so on, but not to itself. Connection is non-transitive. If A is connected to B and B is connected to C, it is not necessary that A is connected to C. And finally, connection is weakly anti-symmetric. That is to say, if A is connected to B, it is not necessary that B is also connected to A. It is important to emphasize that connections can result with new entities. That is to say, A and B can form together a new C entity. But it is also possible that the connection itself is the only new phenomenon. There are no new entities, but the connection implies something productive which has not existed before. Connections can make mere aggregates and mereological sums, but they can also form couplings, new holistic entities in which they depend from each other, but they remain separated. And also new unities in which they lose their distinct existence. So this is a kind of a typology: aggregates, couplings, and new unities in which they lose their distinct existence. It seems to me self-evident that individuals in social connections cannot form unities in which they, as connected entities, completely lose their distinct existence. But the distinction between aggregates and couplings is truly crucial. Sarah Rachel Chant argues that in the case of the Hollywood standoff, there is collective, non-distributive responsibility without collective agency. I suppose that the existence of collective responsibility assumes at least a minimal level of emergence beyond individuals. We can model the Hollywood standoff as a connective situation. There is no reflexivity, none of the participants holds the gun to himself, there is no necessary transitivity. The fact that Mr. Good holds the gun to Mr. Bad and that Mr. Bad holds the gun to Mr. Ugly does not imply that Mr. Good holds the gun to Mr. Ugly. And finally, there is weak anti-symmetry. The fact that Mr. Good holds a gun to Mr. Bad does not necessarily imply that Mr. Bad also holds a gun to Mr. Good. And such is precisely the case with the Hollywood standoff. And as we have seen, it is completely legitimate to speak of truly productive connections that cannot be reduced to the connected relata without assuming that the entities connected to each other necessarily form new unities. Perhaps it would be also useful to interpret joint attention as connection. Attention is weakly anti-symmetric and it is non-transitive. And joint attention as a new level of emergence with respect to individual attention is obviously not mere external or internal relatedness, neither is it dependence. It is about being connected, a certain togetherness, as a new level of awareness that produces a coupling beyond mere aggregate. But of course, it depends on the specific given situation where the joint attention can be formed. And the final remark, there is a very modest tradition of elaborating the ethics of complex systems. These philosophers, Cillier and others, try to conceptualize a new ethics that takes into consideration the characteristics of complexity. What interests me is whether we can attribute any responsibility to complex systems themselves, for instance, to the legal system as a complex system. Complex systems are not based on mere randomness. They are highly determined. They consist of interconnected parts, or more precisely, they are distributed across the component parts. And there is self-similarity, that is to say, there are partly shared similarities across each scale of the system's levels. It is a commonplace to claim that the systemic whole is more than the sum of its parts, and on the other hand, that there is no individual agent within the system who takes everyday actions by taking into consideration the whole system. To put it differently, the wholeness of the systems, quasi-togetherness of its parts, can be individually thematized only through some kind of external observation. But it is also claimed that the system constantly thematizes the difference between itself and its environment and its own subsystems on a more abstract level. So what interests me is whether we can speak of the responsibility of complex system, can we blame them, and in which sense?
Thank you very much indeed. This is a very rich and challenging comment. And it contains a clear objection. You're saying that we need not conceive of good, bad, and ugly together as a subject, rather we should conceive of them as connected, interconnected individuals, right? And I want to argue, no, we need a subject, that's got to be the one subject. And it is a subject in virtue of plural pre-reflective self-awareness. And of course, pre-reflective self-awareness is the form of unity of a mind. Now, this is news to me, this metaphysics of connection, and I'm not competent, but I'm very interested. You're saying that it is stronger. What was it? It is stronger than dependence, but weaker than relation. Is that the way it works? Connection stronger.
Internal relation.
And weaker
because
than
external relation is mere mental projection.
Okay. That's interesting. I haven't thought it through, obviously, because I'm not familiar with the connection literature, and this is totally interesting. It's really good. We need metaphysical stuff here. I'm interested. My hunch is that finally what I'm going to argue is that, okay, you've got this, you want to account for the way people are the way people are together when they are a plural subject. I cannot say people are related because it's already favoring one metaphysical view of it. And I probably will argue that whatever conception of that, I cannot avoid the term relation here, but I do not mean it in terms of internal or external, any specific concept of relation. Let's define relation as whatever connections, dependencies, and internal, external relations are versions of. Is that okay? Just for the purpose of this discussion, yes. Yeah? Just as a definition. So you want to argue that we can fully account for the way individuals are related in that newly defined sense without conceiving of them as a subject if we recognize that that relation is actually of the form of an interconnection. And my hunch is that you're going to find forms of interconnection that are obviously not relevant to the case, and forms of interconnection that are relevant to the case and that you simply cannot distinguish for the particular form of interrelation that's happening between good, bad, and ugly. So that you still need to account for the way interrelation in that case is relevant to responsibility. And I'm going to argue then, this is going to be the strategy for my reply to your comment. I'm going to talk, and I'm completely open about it so that you can prepare. I'm going to argue, well, that feature you need to account for. That's plural pre-reflective self-awareness. So what I will do, reading your comment, is that I'm going to find a case where every condition you specify for something to be interconnected is fulfilled, but still no collective responsibility. And I challenge you to make the task difficult for me without resorting to one or another version of plural pre-reflective self-awareness. So either our accounts collapse or your account is insufficient. Now these are empty words, but I'm just depicting, this is my hunch. I haven't a clear understanding of interconnection, but I sense, and you haven't really given, you know, this weaker than stronger than isn't enough for me to have a clear grasp of what it is, but I would say there are certain instances of that being the case without there being the relation that makes two entities suitable for collective reproach. And then I'm going to argue, well, you know, the missing feature you still need to account for is what I offer you. So then I can be, you know, generous and say, well, that's interesting because it is a finer grained, you know, taxonomy of, you know, relations in that general sense, and it's very useful, but it isn't really doing the job. But maybe you convince me. So, but you need to be more specific. This is not, according to what you say, all sorts of stuff can be interconnected.
Sorry?
Very sweet word about it.
Of mere topological connections, yes. It's a very important paper in contemporary mereology.
Yeah. But he doesn't, obviously, I mean, I haven't read the paper, but I cannot imagine he wants to argue that this is the feature in virtue of which two people are in a joint intentional activity together, right? That's not the purpose of the paper, right?
No,
yeah. So, yeah, I guess there's still work to do for you.
It was just reminding us of a rich tradition that was the only point.
I mean, I'm very interested in all that stuff because I think ultimately we need, I haven't figured out the metaphysics of it all. And for a time I was very attracted the metaphysics of the plural subject. You know, is the plural subject a whole with individuals as its part? Obviously that's not a good way to go, right? What is it? And for a long time I was attracted, and I haven't followed up on it, I was attracted to is it collection as identity theory, you know, the Lewis thing? Because this resounds so heavily with what Rousseau says about the ontology of the collective, you know, where Rousseau says weird stuff, but he says stuff that doesn't agree with what you say about connection being non-reflexive. Because obviously, you know, there is a relation between, in Rousseau's thinking, between me as a citoyen with me as a bourgeois. So, and that's the way he can preserve the idea of freedom, even though you cannot do just what you want in the collective. And the weird thing about collection's identity, if that's the right term, and I'm not quite sure, because it's a long time I read it, is that the collection is, ontologically, is the numerical identity of its parts. So, and this resounds with all these problems of us being one. The way we are related in the general sense, and the plural subject is token identity. And that's weird because we're different, right? How can we numerically identical when I'm bald and you have so much hair and there's all sorts of qualitative differences, right? How can we be one? It's impossible, you know, what's qualitatively different cannot be numerically identical. But then there are these theories of identities, you know, relative identities. We can be identical with regards to X, but different with regards to Y. And this is my sense. I'm just talking a little metaphysics and without having an elaborated idea. But yeah, to conclude, I'm very interested in that concept of connection. I've got a strategy to oppose the objection that this makes superfluous the idea of a plural subject. And I guess I have more questions to ask you than you probably have to ask me. But very good, thank you very much.
Can I jump in very briefly? Do you think that systems theory may help?
Oh yes.
Of collective
oh yes, I forgot that part of you, the second part of you. You know, I spent a lot of time reading all that Lumen stuff. And I think it's also a long time ago, but what I found is that ultimately the system is just a reformulation of the subject. So the subject is the idea that there is a particular subject is whatever is what it is in virtue of itself. That's the idea of the subject. You know, Fichte, this Selbstsetzung, all that stuff, you know, or Korsgaard, self-constitution. You know. This subject is not produced by anything other than itself. It's self-produced. And obviously there's this idea of autopoiesis, you know, in Lumen, you know, and this account of the difference between itself and others, you know, that's how it is related to itself, by distinguishing itself from other, and that's totally the subject. You know, that's subject. And then the question is, in virtue of which is it a unity? It is a unity in virtue of that very relation, you know. But then you have to account for how exactly it works, how it performs these functions. And I think then we're basically in this, that is the subject, you know. So I'd say, yeah, if system is not just as Parsons understood it, you know, a system is only an analytical, basically a selection of entities. You know, system is what the analyst decides. It was a heuristic tool. It wasn't an ontological claim. It was an analytical tool. So let me examine the system between you, the bottle, and, I don't know, somebody else. You know, that's a system, and I analyze it. And this is not how systems theory in Luhmann's sense understands system. Obviously, it's not the sense in which you understand system, right? You think it's really out there, right?
Yeah.
And it is what it is in virtue of it distinguishing itself from what it is not, right? Welcome to subject theory. I think that's the same, yeah. Without it recognizing that it's really about the subject and it should engage in studying Hegel and all that stuff. Is that okay with you, or do you want to oppose? Or?
No.
All right. Thank you very much.
I have a question about, so you call a cell subject?
Yeah, it takes the concept of subject a level deeper, because we are talking about subjects of mental attitudes, and a cell doesn't have a mental attitude. Yes. So that's obviously a difference, because it generalizes the concept of the subject to phenomena which are not mental. Nobody would claim that a cell has an attitude, right? So it generalizes the concept. Yeah. But let me just, maybe it's a good tool to understand life. Maybe it's somehow connected to life.
So collective subject
essentially be relational, right? It would be based on the social weapon, explicit awareness, the others, and the relevant differences, and several sections. It would be a sort of quasi-relational subject.
Yeah, I used to call it relational, but I'm not sure anymore after what I've heard about the distinction between connection and relation. You know, it might be actually connectional, or what would the adjective be? Connective, connectivist, or something like that.
My name is Igor Cvej. I'm a researcher here at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and recently made my PhD on Kant theory of feeling.
Kant's theory of
feeling.
Feeling.
I will mostly not talk about mere possibility of collective responsibility, although I mostly agree with your general argument. I will have a question more about some presupposition and implication and more complex situations. Particularly, I want to have a general question about the role of values, specifically about shared values in these situations. For examples you gave are pretty much easy examples, which is perfectly fine when we generally spoke about possibility of moral responsibility. Usually, of course, there are complicated situations, and I think it's particularly important for collective responsibility because we don't speak only what a values person hold, but if the persons share values and in which manner they share it. So, as far as I understand, when you talk about joint attentions and practical knowledge in that situation, you don't mean by it pure cognitivist approach to it, but also involving some shared values and joint emotional engagement. So I just give one different example. Let's say that we are in a train car with 5 other persons, strangers, who are from a different cultural background, and we have some not so clear situation, like, for example, domestic violence, that I should talk about. So we have 5 different actually reactions, and from these learned norm procedures, it is different how the person see which is adequate reaction to those situations. Particularly, I will need to have some relation to the other person's reactions and expression to see if I can make such attitude needed for the practical knowledge. On more extreme situation, when we add to your example, the bull harming innocent victim is actually a neo-Nazi activist who is harming migrants. But then I realized that 5 other people sitting with me are neo-Nazi sympathizers who we have some joint focus, looking at the same situation, have same cognitive input, but this event is totally different colored than in your example. So I certainly could have thought we should do it, but it is certainly that I could not make that attitude for us who are sitting in the train car. So my for brief question is what do you think about the role of shared values in this example? And second question, role of joint emotional engagement. The third question is probably a little bit complicated. Does this then involve some primacy of I-thou relation? Because in some way I need to have I-thou relation with those persons to see their reaction to make these attitudes. And my fourth question is, of course, from the perspective of a third person who will blame his group as responsible, how we can ascribe collective responsibility to those groups, because, again, in this situation about harming innocent victim, a child who's gonna die, it's pretty easy, but if we need to have insight about how they share values or are they shared values, it is very hard to blame some group as collectively responsible. Thank you.
Thank you much. Yeah, shared values, your variation of the the Held example, you're the only non-Nazi in the subway car. There's a Nazi beating up a victim, and you're sitting there and you realize these are all Nazis. Well, I would say it's just a gut feeling. I still would say you've got to try to you've got to approach the other Nazis and try to, you know, appeal to their better senses and intervene. You know, if there's certainly still something you'd have to do. Now, I wanted to argue in the original case that in the trial you should be, even if you did all you could, you should be sitting together with the others. Would this still be the case in your version? You having to sit together with the other Nazis who didn't do anything. Now, and I guess most of you would say, no, you don't have to sit with the Nazis. And I think you're totally right, but only if it is plausible to assume that what was going on was Nazi abuse somehow which implicates as a guilty party in the act all of the others. If there is reason to assume that the bully, the Nazi bully, is actually acting on behalf of the others, then certainly you wouldn't have to sit in the trial, right? But if it just so happens that in a society half of people are Nazis and they have the badge, there's one Nazi, and it is not necessary to assume that he is acting on behalf of this group. I still would say, yeah, well, you know, you the non-Nazi and the other Nazis failed to prevent this act from happening, and you would have to sit. Now, what I want to say, it really depends on all of these stories, you know, all of these examples are always, you know, abstractions from real life whose interpretation highly depends on normal assumptions about what's going on in society, and this also extends to this case. Sharing values. I don't really have an elaborate understanding of what a value is other than a formal object of an attitude. In my mind, a lot boils down to intentionality, and so does the concept of value. Value is whatever makes it rational to have an attitude of a certain kind. So a proposition's being true makes it adequate to believe it. So truth is a value. Whatever is good makes it rational or even intelligible to desire it or to want it or to intend it. So the good is a value. Whatever is great makes it rational to admire it. So greatness is a value, and so on, you know, with negative values. Danger, you know, what is dangerous makes it rational to fear it. So danger is a disvalue, negative value. If that's the concept of value, sharing an intentional state is always sharing a value. If that's not your concept of value, we'll have to discuss. Depending on what you mean by value, I have this idea where value is...
I imagine if you know Helm's theory of emotions, actually, about import and significance. I find you also, when you speak about of emotions in Heideggerian terms as for me-ness or for us-ness, I think that it is more like this than as just object of belief. So having a significance for me, that is enough to say that there is value.
Yeah, there's a theory of emotions which says that the positive or negative nature of our emotions and the intensity of either will depend on the status of a particular value in our value system, which is either affirmed or voted against by a particular experience. Right?
Can you spell this out?
Yeah.
I don't think I understand.
Emotions,
according to which values are what makes us react emotionally, positively or negatively, to certain stimuli, not rational, emotional.
Yeah.
Completely irrational
No,
values.
I think I'm totally on board. You know, what I mean is, with the idea of the formal object, it was introduced basically by Thomas Aquinas and elaborated on Anthony Kenny and all of these people. Recently, Ronnie de Souza had this view of emotions as having a formal object. But I would extend it a little bit. It's not just emotions that have a formal object, but all attitudes. And insofar as they have formal object, this is the value, you know. The value is whatever makes it appropriate, understandable, or rational. You know, it is rational to fear. So from taking an Aristotelian approach, there isn't a conflict between reason and emotion, but rather it is rational to have emotions in the right circumstance, towards the right object, in the right amount, on the right occasion. And what makes this the case for the fear of a dog is it's being dangerous. And for something, if something is evil, it is correct to hate it, you know. Okay, it's a bit extreme example. And for something, if something is true, it's right to believe it, you know. So I guess if this is the concept of value, then any sharing of an attitude is the sharing of a value. It's the same thing.
But there's a strong normative assumption in what you're saying that it's correct to believe this, it is correct to feel this.
Yeah.
Values can also determine actions, emotions, and attitudes for which it is very difficult to say whether it's correct.
Give me an example. Give me an example where it is difficult to say.
For example, various people have very different values, which means that Igor and I may react completely differently with our attitudes to the same value. And this is often the emphasis of the talk about values. So you and I may have completely different values. And it's very difficult to say that either you or I ought to have this particular attitude towards a certain formal object, right? That's a different perspective of values.
Well, it is value. I mean, I didn't make any commitment whether values are out there objectively, or whether values or formal objects are properties that are just assigned by an attitude. So I have no commitments whether the entire set of values, whether we can judge people for their lack of admiration of the great, or whether greatness is just a personal thing. I don't have this value, so I don't admire. The thing about appropriateness I wanted to say is just that insofar as it is assigned, it would be irrational not to admire. You know, there is a conceptual link between greatness and admiration. And even though it might be that people do not have the value of greatness, this just means they don't assign greatness to anything. You know, they don't admire. But if they assign greatness, they have to admire, you know, because greatness is captured or is seen, is perceived in admiration and through no other means. So many values, I mean, the emotional domain is different from cognition or practical attitudes in that it seems that about every emotion has its own formal object. So there is this general, you know, truth and the good. These values play a very general role for theoretical attitudes and for practical attitudes. But then there is the emotional, and, you know, fear has danger, admiration has greatness. And so for every emotion, it has its own formal object. I cannot think of an emotion.
I agree with that, but my problem with the example is just that we could have same focus, the same cognitive input, but actually different formal object.
Yeah.
I see it as
that's true.
The same event I can see as dangerous, but Nazi can see as pleasant or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And then we sort of, we target the same material object, to use Aquinas' term, but not the same formal object. And thereby we do not share the attitude. But if we share the attitude, we share a value, I would say. I'm not quite sure whether I want to say the opposite, that if we assign the same formal object to the same material object, we thereby share the attitude. I'm not quite sure, because I might see the donut on the table as delicious and want it. And you might see it as delicious and want it, but we do not want it together, because I want it for me. So same value, but it actually brings us in opposition rather than bringing us together. So, I mean, here in the domain of the emotional, I very much like the structure that's a bit more complicated than just formal object. There's formal object, there is focus, and there is concern. And the concern rationalizes the relation between the formal object and the focus. So even in fear of the dog, it's dangerousness to me or dangerousness to you. That's rational in this wide sense in terms of concern for my or your safety. Right? So the concern, and I think this is very much what Heidegger had in mind with Sorge, this is a triadic structure. So the target, formal object, focus, and behind it the concern that binds the package together. And maybe the concern is what we are. Yeah, maybe that's, I guess that's what Heidegger wants to say. So are we in a disagreement, or do we agree?
I agree with that. My problem is, have these problems with a particular case have implications on the question how we could blame actually someone, or how could ascribe someone collective responsibility. Could we do it in the same way when there are 6 persons having actually shared values and shared attitudes, as you said, and that I can make these attitudes that we should engage. But in a case that we probably looking at the same event and don't having same formal object or same concerns, could we actually speak about collective responsibility? Because intuitively we would in the same way say that group or person sitting in a train car is to blame because they didn't help.
Yeah. I mean, there are two, I haven't sorted this out in the paper, and I'm really not sure about it concerning the epistemic restrictions to responsibility. One way is what Held says in her paper, and I'm just taking it from there, is that you have to be aware of the moral nature of the act. And this is obviously insufficient, because in many cases we blame people even though they weren't aware of the moral nature of the act, because they should have been aware of the moral nature of the act. And this was applied to the Nazi case. So these people, they think, well, there's something good going on, that's good for the purity of our ideology and ethnic group and so on, it's a good thing. So what they think, the belief they have about what's going on is mistaken. And we hold them responsible even though they didn't know the moral nature of the act, because they thought it was something different. Why? Because they should have known. In that case, we're going normative about the epistemic requirements. And I guess we would do this in the plural case as well, even though what you think is going on is very different from what the others think what's going on, because they should have thought differently. And I mean, in a sense, you know, subjectivity is a normative phenomenon. You know, it doesn't depend on what anybody thinks. Sometimes we say you should have been aware, and And that's enough for assigning responsibility. But it is also true that in many cases there is excusable error. And in these cases, your not having known is at least an attenuating circumstance, right? We still assign some blame because you should have known, but we lower our blame because of you having been in error about the moral nature of the act. We wouldn't do so with regards to Nazis, but you know, with Nazis, this is pure evil, so it's very harsh. It's always good to choose somewhat different cases. Okay.
This is something very, very relevant to the issue of command responsibility in war crimes trials. Look at the example of the civil wars. The international tribunals from Yugoslavia, Rwanda, this has been a big issue. There's a principle in international criminal law which says that the commanding officer has a responsibility for the actions of the subordinates. Because if they didn't know what the subordinates were doing, they should have known.
Yes.
They were supposed to have known.
Yes.
And then look at the realities. They couldn't have possibly known. They had nowhere close to what they assumed to have the authority to control their subordinates in track shoes and trainers and automatic guns. Yeah? So there's a big gulf between what we claim that they should have been able to do and the reality, where we ourselves would not have been able to act.
Yes.
So there's a danger in this idea of subjectivity as being normative, that it borders with arbitrary. We do need to inform it by something, by the way people actually function, the way people actually make decisions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that this is very interesting, and especially interesting when it is discussed on particular cases. And your example certainly points towards a danger in that plural version of responsibility, when there is no way and they couldn't have gotten their act together. On the other hand, I want to give you an example where it is even no question about the individual being in a position of doing something about it, and this is historical. Okay, let me start with a personal example. I was in New York in '99. It was an exciting time for being a Swiss person in New York, because there was this whole discussion about Nazi gold in Switzerland. And it was interesting because, you know, the Swiss, usually they used to be, you know, these harmless cheese, chocolate, watches and cow people. And now, all of a sudden, they were sort of nasty, you know. And in New York, you could feel it. I thought I could feel it, you know. Well, you took the Nazi gold. And I felt implicated. There is a sort of response. And I think this response is adequate because I'm in this as a Swiss national. And even though it's about something I couldn't have because I wasn't alive, you know, you still, you know, you're a member of that plural subject. Of course you're in it. So even though I was a stout individualist at the time, my emotions already were tracking something about plural subjectivity. And of course, now in my institutional setting, this direct democracy, you always can do something about anything. Maybe you should participate or maybe initiate an initiative, you know, and clean up the situation. So it is connected to something you can do, very clearly in my case, because the Constitution provides ample opportunity of living up to the responsibility you have as a citizen. And that's not everywhere the case. But still, I think there is some opportunity, you know. politics is something we're doing together. And however subordinate we are, there's usually no power can exist without some form of, recognition of it. I guess this is a basic tenet of current social ontology, that it boils down to these, collective acceptances. Now, these are not always, it is usually not transparent to people that it all exists because people just go along with it, and especially in situations of war, it's obviously not just collective acceptance. Sometimes you're just being held at gunpoint, so where is the collective acceptance element here? It's sheer force, right? And institutional frameworks usually make it difficult to see for the participant, or make it difficult for the participant, just to get together and deliberate on what it is, what we should be doing. Because everybody is in a position, with special duties and responsibilities. And people usually withdraw to an individualistic perspective, and they just ask themselves, what is it I should be doing? They're starting to think in individualistic terms. They think all moral responsibility they have is basically individual. And what they can do is either to do their job or to, under grave consequences, not do it. And what's not visible in this framework is that the whole structure, organization somehow is in place because, they together go along with it. And it may not be, it may not just be a distributive thing. It's not because everybody is doing it, but because all of them are not doing what all of them should be doing, namely deliberate about how to live together. I'm losing a bit contact to your initial thing, but I think it's totally important. I want to discuss it. So,
there was a mayor of a small Bosnian town called Milanović during the war in former Yugoslavia, wasn't it? And this guy, when the war erupted, this was a guy like most suspects for war crimes with no criminal record, an exemplary citizen, ordinary person, no violent, and suspected member of the community. So an ordinary guy. He was a mayor of the town of Shamat. And the moment the war erupted, he immediately became automatically the commander of civil defense force. And the civil defense force in Shamat were largely criminals over whom Milan Simic had no way of exercising any de facto control, who had committed crimes. Milan Simic has since been indicted and convicted at The Hague of war crimes based on command responsibility. He is now serving, I think, 20 years for the crimes committed under his command. Now, this guy had two choices. He could have gone along, shut his eyes as he did, and simply try to live through what was going on without being able to control anyone, or he and his family could have most likely shared the fate of the victims. But formally, he was in power. Mm-hmm. He wasn't held at gunpoint. It was implicit. It was all implicit. It was all in the fine details of collective action.
Yeah.
Now, how does that fare in your account?
I mean, it's a weird situation for me because I generally dislike passing judgment on people, I sort of, my move towards social ontology was because I always felt that somehow this constant normative ethics, what people should be doing, that somehow fails to capture first what's really going on.
Yeah.
What are we talking about? That was my move, the idea behind doing social ontology. Instead of just, saying capitalism is wrong or stuff, seeing what's going on, what are we talking about? But now I see myself in the position, I have this concept of plural subject, and the question now is this, how is this guy in it? I mean, obviously he is in it, right? There is some some sense, unless he's being held at gunpoint. I'd say there's something. There's a role he performed in this obviously bad joint action of, I don't know, policing, whatever. But then again, there is this, and we know about the Nuremberg defense, right? The Nuremberg defense is, well, you know, I had to do it, was orders, and I would have faced grave consequences. And yeah, but I must say I'm giving in to my disinclination to pass judgment here. I mean, this is very complicated because a lot of organization comes in. It's easy to see in the pure cases where there is just a bunch of people, but here is organization. Here's previous organization and it changes, and then there seems to be a role which all of a sudden becomes something very different. So that the question is whether to stick to the role or to abandon it. And it might even be that subjectively, I'm currently interested in cases in which it seems to be that that we do not know what it is we are doing together, because there are very different conceptions of what it is we are doing together. And this might also apply to this case. I'm rambling. But I sense this is really important.
There are no definite answers. It's just a sense of my problem with this account. I agree with 90% of it, but my problem with this account is with this idea that we should know what is right for us to do. That our obligation arises from our collective understanding that we should be able to determine what we should do. And I think in reality, this is more often not the case than the case.
I agree.
Especially in challenging circumstances.
I agree.
So, yeah, I have dilemmas about it myself.
Okay, thank you. Let's move forward with the questions. That's my name. Introduce the philosophy session. Dear colleague of mine, Srđan Prodanović, sitting over there, hidden at the moment, and myself prepared a short intervention. So I'm going to read it, but first of all, we want to thank you for inspiring article and oral introduction as well. Our remark refers, we would say, to the stronger side of your argument, namely to its formalism. In the paper, you convincingly explained that there are collective actions, or their absence, in which accountability can be attributed to random collections without being distributed to its members. That is, you maintain that collecting responsibility is of the collective rather than distributive sort, and that this type of responsibility therefore implies a certain plural self-awareness. The latter is not a collective singular, but rather something individuals have, not someone else over and above their heads, and they have it only together as a group. In this sense, we can understand your claim that even unorganized random collections can be plurally self-aware of what should be done as a collection of own collections of the sort that constitutes responsibility, if I state it well. However, one might ask, in the line Igor talked about and sharpening his argument, what could actually or potentially members of these random collections in fact be morally required to do? That is, should any provisional set of beliefs, shared moral outlooks as you call them, be shared by aforementioned members? There is no need for thought experiments in order to illustrate the issue. Namely, your example, a bully harasses someone in the public transportation. This sounds like a clear and, so to say, self-explanatory type of demand that a moral instance puts before us. But let's further complicate and problematize this example. This year, a passenger hit a fellow traveler on a bus in Istanbul because she was wearing shorts during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan.
It seemed to him that she was not dressed properly and that she consequently offended the public moral. Hopefully that's a fair interpretation.
That's not only an example, that was an event in Istanbul. Yeah.
Okay, so she didn't have a scarf on, or what else?
She has
shorts,
small shorts. You know?
All right, okay.
Shorts.
And somebody beat her up because...
Yeah, because it's Ramadan. And
all right, all right.
So, following your claims, we do not see a way out of the argument that in this case, the passenger acted responsibly in regard to his own understanding of moral responsibility, and that, furthermore, we could even blame other travelers for disobeying a rule prescribed by one type of moral intuition. Seems like this moral reasoning would be at least as right as on the other side blaming the attacker, who in fact ended up receiving a substantial sentence, yes I know.
Yeah.
Or the co-travelers for failing to defend the attacked woman. Of course, all of this is done from another framework of value, but that's precisely the point. Are those frameworks or systems or regimes that decide on what constitutes a moral wrongdoing equal? And are they commensurable at all? In short, how, or perhaps from which vantage point, do we decide on the responsibility of a random collection? Thank you, that's my point.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, mine was a clear-cut example. I'd say that. So what was the situation? That was in Istanbul, or
Istanbul, yes. Rasko is an expert, so.
All right, and how strong was the bully?
Strong enough for
the beating up, and nobody reacted. Was that the case?
I think the bus was almost empty.
Almost empty, but some people were there and they didn't do anything, or?
I'm not sure.
It happened so quickly. It happened so quickly. This was one hit, and he went out from the bus.
Okay. So just one person in the bus, and.
I think perhaps there were also other people.
Okay, let's assume there were other people.
On the video footage, you can see only him hitting the girl and going out.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say I'm inclined to say that nowadays everybody should know that this is not okay, and that whoever was in the bus constitutes a collective that's guilty of not intervening. If the bully was of average size, I would say even just an individual should have intervened. In German, this is called unterlassene Hilfeleistung. I don't know the English term, but you're obliged to intervene if it's not at too great a risk, and if there is a chance of being successful. Ought implies can, of course. You should do something about it, and I tend to say that the excuse that you might think this is a good thing because it's really bad to be dressed that way, that doesn't work nowadays. I'm not so sure with regards to older systems or maybe remote corners of the world. We had this witch example, and if you really empathize for a second with this evil view, if you seriously think that there's something so bad about the dress that it contaminates the whole society with something that brings about death and suffering, because you have to take other moral standpoints seriously, right? So let's try to enter such a person's head and try to think of something that makes it understandable that that person beats up that woman. Of course, it may just be misogynistic aggression, right? That person just takes that moral view as an excuse to beat that up because that person is hateful and wants to beat up somebody anyways, is just looking for victims and takes the ideology as excuse. I think this is most likely the case in Istanbul, because Istanbul is really this is an educated society, even if you're if you're somewhat backwards, there's a lot of information there, and people should be able to know. But if you take a case from a remote village where, you know, incredible beliefs are around, and it is believed that the way you dress really is connected to the well-being of the community, you really believe that, then maybe the case is different. But as I said, I'm not an expert in normative ethics, and the basic aim behind the paper is to show that this issue about plural pre-reflective self-awareness has consequences for normative issues. And I'm a bit naive about the normative issues. I just took Virginia Head's paradigm and showed that actually to understand that better, you can use the concept of plural pre-reflective self-awareness. So I'm now I'm operating far beyond my sphere of expertise. If I'm passing a normative judgment about people sitting in Istanbul in the bus while this beating is going on, there are normative ethicists. I'm not one of them. I'm even somewhat disinclined against the whole discipline, because I sense that the way we judge normatively is to some degree misinformed about the ontology, because these people tend to be individualists, and they do not see that there is social reality and do not take it into account. But I'm just giving you my moral intuitions. That's all I can do. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to try to a little bit change maybe perspective and use several analogies. This is not a question, maybe this is rather a need to put forth a request to you to once again explain this phrase plural pre-reflective self-awareness. But not because I know your different text, but in this text, how to, in context of collective responsibility. As I understood, your main efforts will be to show us that someone is responsible if exists some kind of pre-reflective self-awareness. You know, this is the condition, unconditional condition. Yeah. First of all, when I preparing for our meeting today and tomorrow, I read a little Waldenfels on Aufnehmung, and you remember there is nothing about collective awareness, but in Nathalie Depra's her book from 2 years ago, Attention et Vigilance, she speaks of attention on conjoined intersubjective attention.
What's the phrase, conjoining?
Attention conjointe intersubjective. Conjoined, we can say, intersubjective attention. And as you know, as a phenomenologist, we can say this is also always an object that implies attention. There is no attention without object, and in your case, this object could be situation. For example, the collective responsibility involved with any random collection of strangers in situations that demand a multilateral action. I'm interested in the relation of this plural pre-reflective self-awareness. Yesterday I found this, you know, that Nida Rümelin, and I tried to find how because he's using this kooperative Verantwortung and kooperative Verantwortung, but as you know, his position that I'm scaring for him, for example, you know that very well, that exists only individual responsibility. There is
they are very sad, yeah.
Yeah, collective Verantwortung is figurativ. No? But plural pre-reflective self-awareness, and the relation of this to time or temporality of the existence of a group, because this is temporal, or you have a group which is temporal, or the very, how to say, very, very fast interrupted. Because the turn will be, I'm interested in responsibility that constitutes a group, not why this, because that's why analogy. I hope that you remember this text. This is text of Moritz Schlick, text from 1930. Wann ist der Mensch verantwortlich? When is the man responsible? And one of the main condition is consciousness. That means, I quote Schlick, but much more important that the question of when a man is said to be responsible is that of when he himself feels responsible. Fühlt. Wenn sie wörtlich fühlt. I think that, well, this is a little bit, could say, challenge that there is no responsibility if somebody is not just have consciousness of responsibility, but if individual feels responsible or responsibility. In that case, well, it will be good to explain, does exist some kind of cogito of the group, not just, well, analogy, individual, collective, because that could be awareness of responsibility. And the other example is completely, how to say, also change perspective. This summer, one evening, this summer in one restaurant in Greece, a young American was beaten to death by some 12 persons in a span of some 20 seconds. The perpetrators have all been apprehended. Some of them knew each other, that means restaurant, night, 11 o'clock. Some of them knew each other, while others joined in when the situation or object in that case arose. Since there is no more object, there is no more group. No American, in that case, no group. When then is the responsibility of this group? Does the fact that they were all, in that case, Serbian nationality, satisfy this plural pre-reflective self-awareness, and is that enough? Or is object, that means in that case that American, is enough for the constitutional group? In that case, because you have agents very active and how to say, you can impute all of them individually responsibility, we can say, action. They will confirm that they acted. In the same time, they are group or not. And where you can find this plural pre-reflective self-awareness in that case? Because they acted. This is the completely different example. They were very active. Mm-hmm. And we could not say that they were group.
Yeah, of course, I would say there were, well, the way I imagine this American case, clearly there were a group and they knew what they were doing, and then the knowledge involved, the knowing what it was they were doing, the form of the knowledge is plural.
Mm-hmm.
And this
but does exist pre-reflective something in that case?
Yes.
We have object.
Yeah.
And we are.
The object is the victim, right, on which harm is inflicted by means of their beating up that person together. And the feature and virtue of which this is an intentional joint action is the plural pre-reflective self-knowledge of the agent. And the agent is the individuals together. Mm-hmm. So they together knew what they were doing, and that's the feature and virtue of which they did it intentionally. So the subject of the act is them. Not an extra entity, not an additional subject, but they together, they as one. That would be my description of the situation. Mm-hmm. And of course it has nothing to do with nationality or background. They may come from different backgrounds. It's just the intention, the form of the feature and virtue of which the act is intentional, that's plural. And let me state the ontological claim. My claim is that this is what groups are. So this is an ontological claim about subjectivity. Groups are plural pre-reflective self-awareness in the very way in which individual subjects are singular pre-reflective self-awareness. That's how you are a subject. You are a subject in virtue of your being self-aware of your attitudes as yours. And that's not enough.
Is it enough to say, because that was very quickly, a group was constituted just in several seconds?
Yes. You know, it comes about in a second. Yeah, if I address you and we talk just for a brief moment.
Anyway, it's not a problem if it was the group. Anyway, but who doesn't matter? Well, first of all, we will have a problem with judging, how to evaluate all actions separately, etc., etc. But this is not a group. That group there is no, in that case, in Schlick case, there is no feeling of responsibility. How to say, they could not thematize their action, for example. I have a problem, I not have the problem with this plural pre-reflective awareness, but I have a problem with self-awareness in that case. How to constitute in 12 seconds something entity? Well, this is if you put the time, how we can arrange the groupness of the group in such a small period of time. That's the.
Yeah, my claim is radical. I want to argue that there's plural pre-reflective self-awareness, and I would claim that there's no awareness without self-awareness. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're aware of the cup of coffee, there is something inbuilt. Yes. Unless, I mean, some people say that in deep meditation there is awareness without self-awareness. I tried it, it didn't happen to me, but some people describe it, that you're so lost in what you are aware of, that you're not self-aware, that awareness is no self-awareness. It is described, but I didn't have it. Maybe experiences of depersonalization somehow. There is awareness without self-awareness. Otherwise, I would say, that self-awareness is a feature of any awareness. And if it's plural, it is a group. Now, if you want to argue with Schlick, I didn't quite get that, and I must, very much to my shame, a professor of philosophy who walks over the stairs on which Moritz Schlick was killed, have not read the paper on wann ist der Mensch verantwortlich, and I will do so. I hope it's not too long. I will do so in the future. Have I understood you or Moritz Schlick correctly that the claim is that there is no responsibility without feeling responsible?
Yeah.
Because that strikes me as a rather untenable claim. Because, you know, I have plenty of examples where there is responsibility without the subject, the perpetrator, feeling responsible. You know, that to me it is a non-go, because, you know, you haven't felt responsible then, but you were responsible, and now you should feel responsible. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how... And with that, you seem to buy into the view that there has to be not just self-awareness, but some, you know, reflective accounting for awareness, yes, of whatever count. Yeah. And I think this building way too much structure into responsibility. Don't you agree? I mean,
yeah.
I hit somebody without feeling responsible, and that gets me off the hook. Come on. This is not a suitable offense to say, well, I didn't feel responsible.
Okay, maybe, never mind. Maybe this is the part of the how to say, of the construction of the responsibility, of the scene of the responsibility, because, you know, thank you.
That's interesting.
Marcelo talks about emotional affection, and he says that we should distinguish between our sense of selves and my emotions which I feel on my own, and the emotions which I may be aware of as my own, whereas in fact they are caught from someone else. And this explains mass psychology.
Oh yeah. Oh, Max Scheler has very weird stuff about mass psychology. And if you really want to defend what Scheler says about, you know, idiopathic and heteropathic emotional identification, if you really want to defend that, I want to talk to you. Because to me it seems utterly weird. There is Mesmer's theory. You know, he says, just as an example, he says that the snake has this capacity for, I don't know what, which...
The repetitive desire on a rabbit,
so that...
throws itself in the mouth.
Oh yeah, exactly, you really read it. Do you believe it? Do you believe it?
I do it.
Oh wow, this is great. To me, it reads like, you know, weird turn-of-the-century esoteric theories that are totally without...
This is a report from a British officer on the ground.
All the worse, I would say, you know, whoever would trust the British officer.
What about the caterpillar, who stings the other caterpillar and lays eggs in the caterpillar without the ability to actually know anything about the other caterpillar? One caterpillar stings the other, one bug stings the caterpillar in a particular spot where it paralyzes the caterpillar and allows the bug to lay the eggs. And he says, is this esoteric as well?
No, I mean the phenomenon, but I think you do not need a notion. Let me, my recollection is a bit weak. I read this passage. It's such a wonderful taxonomy of emotional sharing in Scheler, but then there is this long excursus about emotional identification, and there he brings all that weird literature. I mean, for the stinging, I do not need any, you know. He has an interesting claim, but he puts it in a very weird way. He seems to want to argue that, and I endorse that claim, that the way we identify, that the way we individuate emotional states need not be according to individual minds. So, you know, there is this strong there can be one token emotion with many participants. And I think this is totally right. I want to defend that, but I want to defend that without wanting to claim that there's something about the snake in virtue of which it instills in. So the desire the rabbit has, or I think it's a mouse, is actually the snake's desire. You know, it's actually that desire the snake then has by means of heteropathic identification, and the mouse is jumping in the snake's mouth on the snake's desire. So it's like remote control, you know, it's my desire that makes you act. It's like, you know, telepathic, I'm having you on my strings.
But haven't you felt it in interhuman relationships I had, where someone overwhelms you with their desire, and you succumb, despite all the impulses that you
Yeah, but you just want to please them. You're charmed by them and you want to please them, and you're acting on your desire to please them. They are so charming that you just want to, you know, you want to open up and you want to conform to their wishes, but you want to, right? And it certainly, it doesn't make you I mean, in the mouse doesn't want to die, but it's acting on the snake's desire. The snake, it's not, in a very basic sense, it undercuts any notion of agential autonomy. And I do not mean autonomy in an elaborate sense, but just in the sense that individuals are agents of their own, in virtue of their behavior insofar as it is action, being explicable in terms of their intentions, desires, and beliefs. I want to hold on to this, and I challenge any, you know, this is basic individual intentional autonomy, and I think any account of intentional sharing has to conform to the view that individuals are intentionally autonomous. By the way, Scheler is not the only one with weird theories. It's also in Aristotle, where he talks about slavery, the slave, the principle of the slave's action is in the master. So, you know, the slave is actually, insofar as this is true, the slave is actually the extended body of the master. And I think this is a great epistemic injustice done to the slaves, because it's a description of a social institution that does not do justice to what the slaves really were, namely acting individuals, agents of their own. So in that case, it gets normatively nasty. In Scheler's case, it just gets weird. You know, it's basically a theory of hypnosis that's behind it. And among my many students, I had one who actually practiced hypnosis for, you know, in terms of a show. And I asked them, I had him in a seminar, and I asked him whether he thinks it's real. Is it really the case that he controls people's attitudes? And he told me that he believes that, well, you know, basically people have to want to go along, otherwise it doesn't work. And that wanting to go along, you know, that offers you all the explication in terms of individual intentional autonomy you need.
Yeah, except that I don't agree that this is identifiable with hypnosis. Hypnosis has a specific technique which is based on the idea that you have to agree to hypnosis,
yeah,
to want to be hypnotized. Look at the example of psychopaths. Psychopathy is one of the hottest debated subjects in psychiatry. Psychopaths are people who are able to charm hundreds of very intelligent people who are not easy to charm and who hate them. They are not charmed, they hate the psychopaths. And still, they follow the will of the psychopath.
So they go along against their own will, they are sort of magnetized.
Yeah, this is esoteric, but it's empirical as well.
I want to see the evidence. I want to see the evidence. I mean, I'm disinclined. And as a phenomenologist, I need to have the experience. And, you know, to be honest, I would like to be able to make that excuse in some cases, which I did. But it is an excuse. And if I'm honest, I have to admit to my own, you know, my own intentions, desires, and cognitions being quite enough to explain what I did. It's it easily becomes an excuse, you know. I didn't want it, he wanted it, and his will was so strong it took over. Okay, dann zu Heidegger. Mein Beitrag fällt etwa aus der Diskussion aus. Ich möchte diese Gelegenheit nicht so vergehen, um Sie diese Frage zu stellen, die ich auch in etwa in dieser Form auch dann Zahavi gestellt habe. Also die betrifft dann eigentlich die zentralen Thesen und Voraussetzungen ihrer Intentionalitätstheorie beziehungsweise ihrer also auch der Frage der kollektiven Verantwortung, aber vor allem der kollektiven Intentionalität. Okay. Also in diesem Zusammenhang möchte ich die Frage nach dem Subjekt oder eigentlich dem Selbst, also um genauer zu sein, weil das um Selbst geht das also hier, vor allem nach dem Selbst der Intentionalität und damit auch der kollektiven Verantwortung als eine Form der Intentionalität stellen. Also meine These ist die, damit um den phänomenologischen Gebot, und das kennen wir alle, zu den Sachen selbst gerecht zu werden, schlage ich zusammen mit Heidegger vor, nicht bei der Wahrnehmung oder Anschauung, beziehungsweise bei der Gegebenheit oder wie auch immer verstandene Präsenz, sondern bei der Absenz und der Sorge anzusetzen. Und Sorge im Heideggerschen Sinne. Okay. Sie haben das zwar in einem Aufsatz schön, also die Probleme dieses Heideggerschen Fürsorgekonzepts herausgearbeitet, das gefiel mir sehr. Nur meine Idee ist, dass man diese soziale Dimension der Heideggerschen Philosophie, vor allem der existenziellen Ontologie, von seinem Temporalitätskonzept, also Zeitlichkeitskonzept herangehen soll. Natürlich ist es Fürsorge und Mitsein, das sind die zentralen Punkte, darauf beziehen sich alle, wenn es um die soziale Dimension oder also die Wichtigkeit der Heideggerschen Theorie für die soziale Wissenschaften oder überhaupt Gesellschaftstheorie geht, also dann bezieht man sich auf das Mitsein und, auf die Fürsorge. Doch ich meine, also man sollte das gesamte Konzept betrachten. Das heißt, wenn wir über die Frage der Intentionalität, wenn es um diese Fragen geht, also dann sollte es auch sein Zukunftskonzept also mit bedacht werden. Also ich komme noch darauf. Also nicht wie bei Husserl von der Selbstwahrnehmung, Selbstgegebenheit, eigentlich der Selbstevidenz, wie auch immer, sondern von der antizipativen, zukunftsorientierten Selbstsorge auszugehen. Die Frage lautet also, ob sich so etwas wie Gegebenheit, Präsenz ursprünglich selbst konstituieren kann oder ob es eher dem Zukunftsbezug, also dem Entwurf, dem eigentlich Heidegger gesprochenen Seinsentwurf, das Primat bei der Frage der Konstitution zukommt. Also was überhaupt die Intention ist. Ich wollte ursprünglich auch vom Levinas sprechen, wir haben jetzt keine Zeit darauf, weil es auch um die Verantwortung geht. Gleich mit der Seinsfrage ist die Verantwortung gekoppelt, also Sein und Sollen gehen so schön ineinander über, aber das lassen wir jetzt außen vor. Aber da ich diese These aufgestellt habe, will ich nur betonen, dass es auch hier um eine Art von Absenz geht, die konstitutiv ist. Also beziehungsweise eine absolute Differenz im Hinblick auf den anderen, also absolute Transzendenz, woraus sich dann auch eine absolute und eine absolute Asymmetrie bei der Verantwortung also herausgibt. Aber auch ein Konzept der Absenz. Dann auch Ricoeur, der sich auf Kant bezieht, also in seinem Konzept der Versprechen. Also ich muss das Versprechen als eine Art regulative Idee in dem Sinne einhalten, damit sich dieses Raum meiner Intentionalität überhaupt konstituieren kann. Ich muss etwas versprechen, damit das auch einhalten kann. Eine Verantwortung kann sich nicht in eine Urimpression sozusagen aufstellen. Oder überhaupt ein Gefühl der Intentionalität. Okay.
Also die zentrale Funktion des Wahrnehmungsbegriffs scheint hier also ein Problem zu sein. Und das auch, ausgehend von Husserl gehe ich davon aus, also da finde ich eine ganz klare Linie zu ihrer Theorie und so von Dan Zahavi. Also Selbstwahrnehmung, die Wahrnehmung, also ein Gefühl, ein Sinn für uns, ein Sinn für mich. Und also was ist das für eine Gegebenheit? Wie kann sie sich konstituieren? Wie hält sie sich in der Zeit auf? Wie ist sie nicht indifferent? Also im Hinblick auf die existenzielle Frage. Warum bedeutet mir etwas? Also dieses Gefühl des Kaffeetrinks, von dem Sie heute sprachen, also warum ist das bedeutungsvoll? Also es gibt Intensitäten, aber das sind indifferente Kontinuen. Also indifferent in dem Sinne, dass sie nicht bedeuten, also existenziell bedeuten können. Also im Grunde kann das auch ein Rechner, also intensive Kontinuität, also bestimmte Intensitäten vorbringen. Aber warum bedeutet das etwas? Das heißt, es muss ein Zukunftsbezug sein. Wir müssen auf etwas aus sein, damit es diese Intensität sozusagen bedeutungsvoll wird, damit man nicht indifferent ist, also im Hinblick auf diese Intention. Das heißt nicht, dass dieser Zukunftsbezug präsent sein muss, damit der Begriff als Begriff geklärt sein soll, damit er definiert sein soll. Er kann vage sein, aber es ist immer diese Intensität ist immer ursprünglicher in einen Erwartungshorizont eingebettet. Also das ist das, was. Um zum Schluss zu kommen, also nochmal, also ich überspringe das noch, also ist dieser Zukunftsbezug konstitutiv, also ursprünglich konstitutiv, ich würde das bejahen, jedoch nicht, indem ich wie Heidegger beim Dasein phänomenale Aufweise unbedingt einer Todesgewissheit also liefere, sondern indem ich diese Annahme von dem konstitutiven Vorrang der Zukunft in gewisser Weise operationalisiere. Was heißt das? Denn womit haben wir bei der Differenzierung der kollektiven Intentionalitäten zu tun? Wie unterscheiden sie sich voneinander? Nach dem Gefühl oder wie das sich konstituiert hat in einem Moment? Oder wenn nicht im Umgang mit dem wenn nicht im Hinblick auf den Umgang mit dem gemeinsamen Sein können, also im Hinblick auf die Möglichkeiten. Und dann gleich das Beispiel zum Schluss, zum Beispiel eine geschäftliche Partnerschaft hat einen anderen Zukunfts- und Möglichkeitsbezug als eine Liebesbeziehung. Die konstituiert sich nicht in einem, natürlich ist sie begleitet von gewissen Wahrnehmung und einem Gefühl und einer Präsenz. Aber wie konstituiert sich jetzt in einem Moment eine geschäftliche Beziehung und dann eine Liebesbeziehung, die eingehalten werden soll, eine Intention auf etwas? Ja? Natürlich im Aussein auf etwas. Das muss kein praktischer Ziel in dem Sinne. Da muss nicht unbedingt Handeln sein. Ein ganz klares, erreichbares Ziel, sozusagen vorgeben. Es kann auch Wünsche und Fantasieren und alle Intentionen, die da. Aber es muss ein Erwartungshorizont gegeben sein, damit sich das konstituiert. Also die Entwürfe, Erwartungen etc. sind unterschiedlich in dem Sinne. Also nicht die Selbstwahrnehmung, sondern die eigene Zukunftsbezug, die Sorge eigentlich, ist hier von der Bedeutung. So, da wende ich. Das war's. Jel bilo razumljivo, ne znam, nije baš, ali dobro. Drugi put.
Also danke. Ist Deutsch lieber oder Englisch?
Sie können auf Englisch, also ich verstehe es, Sie können auf Englisch, ich werde eventuell auch.
Ja. Is everybody fluent in German?
No, lieber English.
Okay, I'll respond in English, because I know I have a nasty accent in English, but as a Swiss person, I also have a nasty accent in German, so it's about the same problem. Yeah, thank you very much. So I guess the basic question is there some Zukunftsbezug in intentional states, and how does it play out in the collective case?
Also nicht nur kollektive, aber auch kollektive.
Yeah, and also then maybe related to it, aren't Dan Zahavi and me too much committed to this metaphysics of presence, and aren't we ignoring the constitutive role of absence to whatever is at stake here, right? I don't know. I have a question to ask you first. What did Dan Zahavi reply to this comment or question?
Also ich hatte noch 3 solche Fragen.
Noch 3, okay.
Ich werde das morgen.
Okay, I'm interested in hearing because I'm...
Okay.
I would say that obviously for intentional attitudes such as desires or intentions, there is a relation, there is inbuilt conceptual, there is some temporality in the having of the attitude because, these are conditions of satisfaction which have to be met, which cannot already have been met, so that there is, a sense of something not being the case and something being normative as to be achieved in the attitude itself, right? If you intend to do something, there's got to be the sense that it has not already been done, right? So in order to intend, you've got to live in time in some sense, right? I'm not sure though concerning cognition, because there are these authors, and as I realize you're very liberal here concerning, let's say, unusual positions, okay? So let me quote here another unusual position. Some theologians from the Christian tradition have the concept of the angel, and the angel is a subject, but the only attitude it has is the admiration of God. That's all there is. Now, how is this temporal? Has there be a sense of death? Obviously not, right? It's still an attitude. Maybe angels exist. I haven't got any reason to assume that it's a priori impossible for angels to exist. So here is your counterexample. I'm perhaps a bit more liberal. Not only mortal beings have intentions. And it is interesting for the case of plural subjects, because obviously, and this is a real topic now for investigation, if you take the concept of plural subject seriously, and if you accept, I would claim that Heidegger's analysis of being there is actually a good starting point. This Sorge, Struktur, all of that, that's quite good. So how is this temporal? How does a group project itself in the future? And I guess there's got to be some differences to the singular case. For example, death. Some institutions seem to be premised on the assumption that they are not going to die. For example, the Catholic Church, Ecclesia Militans, is an idea of being, certainly it's going to end at some point, but it then becomes Ecclesia Eterna. So these people seem to think that the way in which they are together is, that's forever. And of course you may now criticize that and say, well, this is like the teenage Sartre who believed he was never going to die. This is actually true. Sartre says that in his youth he believed he wasn't going to die. Then you may say, well, still your death is constitutive for your agency because actually you're going to die. But I have a somewhat different reading of what Heidegger says about death. My reading is the following. So death, he assumes that... Now what's important about death, about you're going to die, And by the way, that's the only way in which we, according to Heidegger of being and time, we are authentic together. That's the only thing we should be saying to each other. You're going to die. Everything else is inauthentic. And that's obviously weird, right? It's not a nice way of relating. The important thing about death in Heidegger is that it is the possibility in which you're not replaceable. So somebody can die for you, but nobody can die your death. my interpretation of this, what I think makes this somehow intuitively attractive is that it really, and then he says, well, Vorlaufen in den Tod, that's awareness that actually you're dying right now, right? Das Leben ist Sterben. And that means that whatever it is you're doing is your doing. And somebody may take over your social role, but nobody can do your doing. So the indexical singularity of your actions, and that's quite a formal feature, and you can explicate this without referring to death. What he wants to point out is that, you know, if you're transparent concerning what you are, you know reflectively that your actions are yours and that you're irreplaceable in what it is you are doing. And that's it, basically. I think that's what makes philosophical sense. And that, I think, plays a big role also in the plural case. You know, groups have to come to awareness, an awareness that their actions are theirs. Transparency, reflective transparency, means good politics, and knowing what it is we are doing. Because we are doing it anyway, but the knowing of it is important because it's the only way by which we can jointly deliberate and change our ways of life. You know, that has to run through reflective transparency. So how are we going to change our ways? That's, you know, that's reflective transparency. First of all, we have to acknowledge what it is we are doing and that it is us who are doing it. And yeah, then we're talking politics.